Hey there and welcome back. If the day is finally behind you and the room has gone dim and there is nothing left that anybody needs from you tonight, then let yourself settle and come with me somewhere warm. We are going to Spain this evening, 500 years ago, into a country that had only just become a country at all, and into the household of a woman who was probably the most formidable person alive in Europe. She had 5 children, 2 boys and 3 girls, and one of the boys died as an infant. So what she had in the end was a son and 3 daughters and a plan. She raised them beautifully, in tents, on campaign, in a moving war, and she taught the girls Latin, and she loved them, and then she spent every single one of them on the map of Europe like coins on a table. And within 20 years of the eldest walking down the aisle, that whole golden family was gone. One in childbirth, one at 19, 6 months married, one worn out by a decade of pregnancies in a foreign country, and the last 2, the 2 who lived the longest, both ended their lives shut in a locked room, in 2 different kingdoms, 1,000 miles apart. Neither of them would sign what they were told to sign. One of them you have heard of. Her name in England was Catherine of Aragon. The other one was her sister, and she was locked up for 46 years. Before we go back to that household, let me say that if these long evenings are a comfort to you, you are very welcome to follow along, and then the next one will find its way to you when you would like the company. And if you feel like it, tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, because I do love reading them. There is something quietly lovely in the idea of a Spanish princess who has been dead for nearly 5 centuries being kept company tonight by so many people in so many far-off rooms, most of whom have only ever been told about the last 10 years of her life and nothing whatsoever about the first 40. But nothing at all is asked of you now, only that you let your shoulders come down and let the day go and come with me into the sun. Picture this. It is high summer in Castile, and the light is white, and the land is the colour of old bread. There is no shade anywhere. The plain goes on and shimmers at the edges, and moving across it slowly is not a court but an army, wagons, mules, priests, secretaries, cannon dragged by oxen, and somewhere in the middle of that long column, a household, chests of books, a chapel that folds up, ladies riding astride because there is no other way to do it, and in among the baggage there are children, small ones, being carried across a war zone because their mother is running the war and she is not leaving them behind. That is where these 5 began, not in a nursery, but in a tent, in a campaign, in the last Christian war against the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. Let us go and meet them while they are still all alive. There were 5 of them who lived, and I want to give you their names now, in order, because for the rest of the evening you will need to hold them in your hand like 5 stones. Isabella came first, in the October of 1470, named for her mother, born before her mother was a queen at all. Then a long gap of 8 years, which is itself a piece of evidence about how hard that marriage was worked and how often the 2 of them were apart. Then Juan in the June of 1478, the only son who lived, and from the hour of his birth the most important child in Spain. Then Joanna 16 months later in the November of 1479. Then Maria in the June of 1482, and Maria had a twin sister who did not live, which is a small fact almost nobody mentions, and which happened in the middle of a war. And last, in the December of 1485, in the Archbishop's palace at Alcalá de Henares, a girl they christened Catalina. She is the one you know. Everything else about her, the whole architecture of her, was built in the 15 years before England had heard her name. Now, the childhood. Their parents were Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. and the marriage between them had welded two kingdoms into one country, and that country was in the middle of the last war of its kind in Europe. For 10 years, the whole span of Catalina's early life and the whole of her sisters' girlhoods, the Spanish crowns were grinding their way south through the kingdom of Granada, taking one mountain fortress after another, and their mother was not in a palace waiting for reports. She was there. I want to be exact, because it is one of the more astonishing facts of that century, and it gets flattened into a sentence. Isabella of Castile ran the logistics of that war herself. She organized the supply, the artillery train, the roads, the money, the recruitment. She invented a field hospital and had it carried with the army, 6 enormous tents with physicians and surgeons in them at royal expense, for ordinary soldiers, which had never been done anywhere and would not be done again for a very long time. She rode to the siege lines. She appeared in the camp in armour, and when a town was taken, she was there to receive the keys. And her children came with her. That is the part that changes everything. These 5 were not raised in a nursery in a quiet palace with a view of a garden. They were raised in the baggage train of an army on the move. They learned to travel constantly. They learned to sleep in different rooms in different towns and think nothing of it. They saw men come back from siege work. They watched a war from the inside, as small children, from a household that was itself a moving military headquarters. And in the January of 1492, when Catalina was 6 and Juana was 12 and Maria was 9, they rode into Granada with their parents and took the keys of the Alhambra, and that 800 years of Muslim rule in Spain ended in front of them. 6 years old. Try to hold what that does to a person. Her first clear memory of the world, or very near it, is her mother taking a kingdom. Not receiving one, not marrying into one, not inheriting one. Taking it, at the head of an army she had provisioned herself, and riding in through the gate of the most beautiful building in Europe. Everything you find surprising about Catherine of Aragon later, in England, when she is on her knees in a courtroom refusing to move, or on a horse in armour at 40 raising an army while her husband is off in France, or writing to her daughter in a locked house, telling her to obey God before the king, comes out of that. She was not a meek Spanish lady who became stubborn late in life. She was the daughter of a woman who took Granada, and she had been there, and she had seen it done. Now the other thing about that childhood, they were together. That sounds obvious, and it is not, because royal children were often scattered, sent to separate households, raised by different women, and these 5 were not. Isabella of Castile kept them with her. Where she could, she had them in the same establishment, taught by the same tutors, moved along the same roads. The 3 younger girls in particular grew up as a set, Juana, Maria, and Catalina. 6 years from the top of that range to the bottom, in the same rooms. They would never be together again after they were grown. Not once. When each of them was married and shipped out, that was the end of it. And no 2 of those sisters ever met again in this life. Every single relationship in this family, after about the year 1500, is conducted by letter across a sea with a delay of weeks or months, in a code of politeness, and often through ambassadors who were lying to both ends. So hold that against the picture of the war camp, 5 children in a tent, in the heat, being taught Latin between sieges, with their mother out at the guns. That is as close as they will ever be. And here is the design that was hanging over all of them, and it was hanging there from the day each of them was born. Their parents had made Spain by marrying each other. It followed in their minds with a kind of iron logic that Spain would be made safe by marrying their children. France was the enemy. France was always the enemy. And so the whole of Europe had to be wrapped around France like a fist. Portugal on one side, so the peninsula was quiet at your back. The Habsburgs to the north and east, so the emperor's family was tied in. England to the northwest, because England was the ancient enemy of France and had a young king's son to spare. Isabella and Maria were for Portugal. Juan and Juana were for the Habsburgs in a double marriage, brother and sister exchanged for brother and sister in the same treaty, which is a thing they actually did. And Catalina, the baby, the last one, was for England, and she was promised there when she was 3 years old. 3. She was betrothed to Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, before she could read, and she grew up knowing that she was going. Not thinking she might go, or hoping to. Knowing, she learned that England was her future the way other children learn their own name. Every year of that girlhood was a preparation for a place she had never seen, in a language nobody around her spoke, at the end of a sea voyage everybody warned her about. And she went, and it went wrong within months, and she was left there. But we are a long way from that. Tonight, in this chapter, they are all still alive. Isabella is a serious, devout young woman of 21. Juan is a golden boy of 13, with the whole peninsula resting on him. Juana is 12 and already too clever and too much. Maria is 9 and placid. And Catalina is 6 years old on a horse in a big mountain valley, riding into a captured city behind her mother. Not one of them will die in the place they were born. 4 of them will be dead within a quarter of a century. And the 5th will not leave one house again for the next 46. Let us go and look at the woman who made them, because you cannot understand a single one of these 5 without her. Isabella of Castile is the most consequential woman of that century, and she is, I think, the hardest to love, and I am going to give you both halves of her, because her children got both halves too. She was not born to rule. That is the first thing, and it explains a great deal. She was the daughter of a king, and the half-sister of the next one, and she was a spare, a girl with a title and a small income, kept in a provincial town with her mother, who was not well, and everybody expected her to be married off somewhere useful and forgotten. She was very nearly married off 3 or 4 times to men she did not want, and one of them died before he could reach her, and another she refused so flatly that the court did not know what to do with her. And then, at 18, she did the most audacious thing any Spanish royal woman had ever done. She chose. She picked Ferdinand of Aragon herself, for reasons of state that were entirely her own reasoning, and she married him in secret, without her brother the king's permission, with a forged dispensation, in a house in Valladolid, with the groom having crossed the country in disguise as a servant to get to her. And when her brother died, she took the crown before anybody could stop her, and then she fought a war of 4 years against her own niece and half of Portugal to keep it, and she won. That is the woman. Before any of these children existed, she had already gambled her life twice, and won twice. And then she governed for 30 years, and she governed hard. The good half is genuinely dazzling. She rebuilt a broken kingdom. She took the royal finances apart and put them back together. She smashed the private castles of the great families. She made the roads safe. She reformed the coinage. She was the most literate ruler Spain had produced. She learned Latin as an adult in her 30s because she was ashamed not to have it, and she filled her court with scholars and printers. She backed a Genoese sailor when everybody sensible told her not to, and that decision, whatever you think of everything that came of it, changed the shape of the world. She heard petitions herself. She sat in judgment. She travelled constantly, because she believed that the sight of the Queen was itself a kind of law, and the other half is very dark, and I am not going to smooth it over. She established the Spanish Inquisition. She and Ferdinand asked for it, and they got it, and it did what it did, and thousands of people died in it, and hundreds of thousands were terrorized by it, and it lasted for centuries. In 1492, the same year as Granada, they expelled the Jews from Spain, a whole people, tens of thousands of them, given a few months to leave the country their families had lived in for a millennium, or convert. It is one of the great crimes of European history, and she did it deliberately, and she believed she was saving souls. Both of those things are the same woman. She is not half saint and half monster with a line down the middle. She is one person, and the certainty that made her fearless in a war camp is the certainty that signed the expulsion. She was completely sure. She was sure the way very few people are ever sure of anything, and that is the inheritance she handed her children, and it is what killed one of them and saved another, and drove a third to the edge of her mind. Now, what was she like as a mother, which is the question that actually matters tonight? Better than you would expect, and worse than you would hope. She kept them with her, she insisted on it. In a century when royal children were routinely handed to a household and seen 4 times a year, Isabella of Castile dragged hers along the roads of Spain behind an army so that she could have them under her eye. She hired the best minds in the country to teach them. She wrote to them constantly once they were gone, and the letters are anxious and detailed and warm. And she spent them every one. She sent her eldest to Portugal at 19, and when that fell apart, sent her back again to a second Portuguese husband, while the girl was begging on her knees not to go. She sent Juana to Flanders at 16 to a man she had never seen. Maria went to Portugal in her sister's place, into her dead sister's bed, essentially as a replacement part. And the youngest was put on a ship across the Bay of Biscay to England at 15 and never seen again. She did that because she believed it was what children were for, not out of coldness. There is no coldness in the letters. She believed absolutely that a princess was an instrument of God's purpose for her kingdom, and that her own feelings and her daughter's feelings were not admissible evidence in that argument. She had felt the same about herself. She had married for the good of Castile and been perfectly happy to. She had ridden pregnant across mountains for it. She was not asking her daughters to do anything she had not done. The difference, and it is the whole tragedy, is that she had chosen. She picked her own husband in secret against her king. Not one of her 5 children was ever allowed to choose anything, and the 2 who tried, in their different ways, were broken for it. There is one more thing about her that I have to give you before we go on, because it hangs over the rest of this evening like weather. She was watched in her own century with a kind of astonishment. There was no template for her. Queens were consorts. Queens were regents at a pinch. Queens did not run wars and courts and treasuries in their own right and win. And she made her daughters in that image on purpose. She had them taught Latin properly, at a level that stunned foreign visitors. She had them taught law, history, scripture, rhetoric. She was building 4 women who could rule, because she had had to, and she assumed they would have to as well. And then she married them into places whose ruling families had no intention of letting them govern so much as a kitchen. Every disaster in this family flows out of that single mismatch. Juana, trained to govern, handed to a Flemish prince who wanted an ornament. Catalina, trained to govern, handed to an English king who wanted a son and could not forgive her for being cleverer than his advisers. Their mother built queens, and Europe wanted wives, and the collision of those 2 things broke every one of her daughters in a different way. She died in the November of 1504, at 53, worn to nothing, and her will is one of the most impressive documents of the age, and by the time she signed it 2 of her 5 children were already dead, and a third was being called insane. But before all that, in the golden years, there was a schoolroom, and what happened in that schoolroom is the reason a Spanish girl could stand up in an English court 25 years later and take on the whole legal establishment of a foreign country in a language she had learned as an adult and win the argument. The education of those 4 girls was the best given to any women in Europe in that century, and I want to walk you round the schoolroom, because it is the thing that makes all of them recognizable later. Start with the woman who ran it. Her name was Beatrice Galindo, and they called her La Latina, which tells you everything, the Latin one, the Latin woman. She was not noble. She came from a modest family in Salamanca, and she was so extraordinary as a child that she was educated when girls were not, and she went to the university city and studied philosophy and medicine and the classics, and she was said to have lectured at Salamanca while she was still a young woman, and the Queen of Castile sent for her. Isabella wanted Latin. She was in her 30s, and she was ashamed that a ruler of her standing could not read the documents of her own church in the original, and so she hired this scholar and sat down and learned it herself as an adult in the middle of running a war. And then she kept Galindo on to teach her daughters. That is the tone of that household. Something is missing, so we will go and get it, and we will not be embarrassed about starting late. So the 4 of them were taught Latin at a serious level, not devotional scraps. Real Latin, grammar, composition, the ability to hold a conversation in it and to write it well enough to be read by scholars. 2 Italian humanists were brought in as well, brothers, to teach the classical authors properly. There was history and law and canon law, which is not usually thought of as a girl's subject, and which would matter more than anybody in that room could possibly have guessed. There was scripture in depth, rhetoric, which is the study of how to win an argument in front of an audience, and alongside all of that, the ordinary furniture of a princess, music, dancing, drawing, riding, embroidery, and the enormous and genuinely difficult business of learning how to preside. Now here is what came of it, and the evidence is not Spanish, it is English, which makes it better. When Catalina had been in England some years, Erasmus, the most famous scholar in Europe, and not a man who handed out compliments to royalty for fun, said that she was a miracle of learning, and that she loved good literature, which she had studied since childhood. Tonsimore, who knew everybody, wrote in praise of her. Juan Luis Vives, a Spanish humanist she brought over, wrote the most influential book of that century on the education of women at her request, for her daughter, and it exists because Catherine of Aragon commissioned it. This is the woman that popular history has handed down as the dull first wife, the pious one, the one who was replaced by the exciting one. She was, by the assessment of the best minds alive at the time, one of the most educated people in England, male or female, and she was making the English court a place where women were taught, decades before it occurred to anybody else there. Sit with the ordinary version of the story for a moment. A king gets bored of his stodgy Spanish wife and falls for a clever young woman with French polish. That is the version. And the stodgy Spanish wife had been reading Latin since she was a child, had been taught by the finest woman scholar in Europe, had commissioned the century's landmark work on female education, and could, and did, out-argue the assembled canon lawyers of 2 nations. Now the sisters. Juana was said to be the best linguist of the 4, and possibly the best musician. She played the clavichord and the guitar, and she danced beautifully, and years later, in Flanders, that education was one of the few things that impressed a court which otherwise found her impossible. She had Latin, French, some Dutch when she needed it. She had, everybody agrees, a formidable mind. Isabella, the eldest, was the pious one, seriously so, to a degree that worried people even in that household. Maria was the quiet one, and nobody wrote much down about her at all, which, as we will see, is the most important fact of her life. Juan, the boy, was educated separately and even more intensively, because he was the point of the whole exercise, and given his own household at 7, and taught to be a king by the best men available. But here is the thing I keep circling, and it is the flaw at the heart of that beautiful schoolroom. What was it for? Isabella of Castile educated her daughters as though they were going to rule, because she had, and because she had needed every scrap of learning she possessed to survive the first 10 years of her reign. She was building 4 versions of herself, and then she sent them to countries where nobody had asked for a version of herself. Portugal did not want a legal scholar, it wanted a womb and a treaty. Flanders did not want a woman who could argue in Latin. The Flemish court wanted the Spanish alliance and a pretty consort who would not interfere. England, for a while, actually did want what she was, and used it, and then stopped wanting it the moment it became inconvenient. Every one of those girls was given, at enormous expense, a set of tools that their marriages then forbade them to use. What happens to a trained mind with nothing to work on, in a foreign country, with no friends and no money and no power, and nobody to talk to in your own language, is not good. It is not good for anybody. Juana went first into that, and Juana came apart in it, and the word they used for what happened to her was mad, and I am not at all sure that is what it was. But before Flanders and before England, before any of the doors closed, there was a stretch in which this family was as fortunate as it ever got, and it belonged to the eldest of them, and it did not last a year. The eldest daughter of Spain was married at 19 to a boy she had never met, and she was happy for 8 months, and it is the only unmixed happiness in this entire family, and it ended with a horse. Her name was Isabella, like her mother, and she had been the heir to Castile for the first 8 years of her life before her brother was born, and I have often wondered what that did to her. To be the whole future of a kingdom, and then to be nothing much at 8, because a boy arrived. She was raised devout, extremely devout, even by the standards of a household that had a chapel in its baggage train. There is a story that she wanted to enter religion and was told, gently and completely, that this was not available to her. The daughters of that marriage were not for God, they were for Portugal. Portugal was the whole point of her. The 2 kingdoms had been at war within living memory. Her mother had fought a 4-year war against a Portuguese king to keep her throne. So the peace had to be sealed, and it had to be sealed with a body, and the body was Isabella's, and the arrangement was made when she was a child. She went in the year 1490, at 19, and she went in a style that beggared everybody. The wedding train was so extravagant that people wrote about it for a generation. Mules in cloth of gold, plate, hangings, a dowry that made the Portuguese treasury blink. Her mother and father took her as far as the frontier and handed her over there, at the border, in a ceremony designed so that neither crown had to enter the other's country. That is the last time Isabella of Castile saw her eldest daughter walk away in health. She would get her back twice, and both times it would be a disaster. And on the other side of that frontier was Afonso, who was 15, and who was the heir to Portugal, and who was by everything we know a delightful boy. Now, understand what these 2 young people were expected to do. They were a treaty in human form. Nobody had asked either of them anything. He was 15, she was 19, and they had been told about each other for years, the way you are told about a country you will one day be posted to. And they fell in love. That is the astonishing thing, and it is very well attested. They took to each other immediately, and they were, by every account that survives, delighted with one another. He was affectionate and eager and young. She was serious and beautiful, and had been braced for something quite different. The Portuguese court, which had expected a stiff Castilian, found that their prince adored his wife, and she adored him back. There were 8 months of it. Feasts, hunting, bullfights, a young couple in a warm country in the sun, and then, in the July of 1491, Afonso went riding by the river at Santarém, and his horse threw him, and he was picked up and carried to a fisherman's hut. and he died the same day. He was 16 years old. She was in the country when it happened. She was 20. What she did next tells you everything about her. She cut off her hair. She put on the coarsest, blackest mourning she could find, and she refused to take it off. She would not eat properly. She would not be consoled. She went back to Spain and she told her parents plainly that she would not marry again, that she would take the veil, that this was finished, and she meant it. She stayed like that for 6 years, 6 long ones, a young woman in black in her mother's household, praying, fasting, refusing every proposal, growing thinner, and everybody around her waiting for her to be sensible about it. And her mother would not let her go into religion, and would not let her alone, because Portugal still had to be sealed. That was the fact underneath everything, and it did not care about a girl in black. The Portuguese sent again. The new heir, Manuel, wanted her. He had wanted her for years, apparently, and now he was king, and he asked for her, and he asked for her repeatedly, and he would not be refused. She said no, she went on saying it, and then, in 1497, she was made to say yes. There is a detail I want to give you here, because it is not in the popular accounts, and it should be. When she finally consented, she consented on a condition, and the condition was this: that Manuel expel every Jew and every Muslim from Portugal, as her parents had from Spain. She would not enter a country that harboured them. There it is. The mother's certainty in the daughter pointed at a crime. Manuel did not want to do it. He had, by the standards of that century, been reasonably tolerant, and his kingdom was full of people who had fled there 5 years earlier from her parents' expulsion. And he did it anyway, because he wanted the marriage and the union of the crowns that might follow, and thousands of families were driven out, or forcibly converted, or had their children taken from them, because a Spanish princess in mourning made it a term of her wedding. I am not going to soften that. That is her, and it is her mother in her, and it is what that certainty does when it is loose in the world. So she married Manuel in the autumn of 1497 at 26, still in mourning for Afonso 6 years on, and there is no account of any affection in it at all. And then, within weeks, her brother died, and suddenly the woman who had wanted nothing but a cell and a rosary was the heir to Castile and Aragon, and her Portuguese husband was going to be the king of everything, and the entire peninsula was about to be one crown. She went to Spain in the spring of 1498 pregnant to be sworn as heir, and they swore her in Toledo, and the Aragonese made trouble about a woman inheriting, as the Aragonese would, and it was still being argued when she went into labour in Zaragoza in the August of that year. She had a son, and an hour later she was dead. She was 27. Her mother was in the room. There is an account of Isabella of Castile at that bedside, and I am not going to reconstruct it, because it does not need me. They wrapped her in the habit of a religious order, which is what she had wanted her whole adult life and had never been allowed, and buried her in a convent in Toledo, and I find that the saddest sentence in this whole story. She got the veil at last. She had to die for it, and the baby lived, and he was the heir to Spain and Portugal both, and his name was Miguel, and he was the answer to everything. We will come to him, but first I have to tell you about her brother, because he had died the autumn before, at 19, 6 months after his own wedding, and his death is the hinge on which every single thing in this family turns. Juan was the only son who lived, and they called him the Angel, and he was 19 when he died, and Spain never recovered from it. He was born in the June of 1478 in Seville, and I want you to feel what that birth was. His parents had one daughter, and a country they had just fought a war to hold, and everything depended on a boy, and here he was. The bells went on for days. The city gave itself over to it. His mother, who was not a sentimental woman about anything, was never quite the same about this child. He was Prince of Asturias, which is what the heir of Castile is called, and he was given his own household at 7, and the best men in Spain were put around him. His tutor was a Dominican who later became a bishop. He was taught by the same humanists as his sisters and more besides. He had music at a level that surprised people, a chapel of his own singers, and he played several instruments and could argue about theory, and by every single account that survives, there are a good many, he was lovely. Not merely accomplished, kind, gentle, courteous, thoughtful, a little grave, the sort of boy that hardened courtiers found themselves fond of despite their professional intentions. Everybody who came near him wrote it down. He was frail, that comes up too, pale, slight, not robust, and there was always a thread of worry about his health running under the praise. He was the whole enterprise. That is the thing to hold. Ferdinand and Isabella had welded 2 crowns together with their marriage, and those crowns were only actually joined in the body of this one boy, Castile and Aragon in one person. If he lived, Spain existed. If he did not, everything his parents had built came apart and went to a daughter, and the Aragonese did not accept female inheritance, and the whole thing was suddenly a lawyer's nightmare with a war at the end of it. One life. It rested on one life, and everybody knew it, and the boy knew it best of all. Now, the marriage. The plan was the double Habsburg alliance, and I want to lay it out because it is the largest piece of dynastic engineering of that century, and it was done in a single stroke. Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, had 2 children, Philip and Margaret. Ferdinand and Isabella had Juan and Juana, so they traded them. Juana would go north to marry Philip. Margaret would come south to marry Juan. Brother and sister for brother and sister, one treaty. Both directions, France encircled. Juana went first in the autumn of 1496 on a fleet of enormous size, and we will follow her later. And the same fleet more or less went back for Margaret, and the crossing was appalling. Storms in the Bay of Biscay, ships lost, the fleet scattered, and Margaret of Austria, who was 17 and one of the most sensible people in this entire story, believed she was going to drown. So she wrote her own epitaph, in French, in verse, a light little rhyme saying, "Here lies Margaret, the noble damsel who had 2 husbands and yet died a virgin," and she sewed it into a bracelet on her wrist so that whoever fished her out of the sea would know who she was and bury her properly. 17 years old, in a wrecked cabin, composing a joke about her own corpse. I have loved that woman for years. She did not drown. She landed in the north of Spain in the March of 1497, and she was ill for weeks, and Juan rode north to meet her. And there is an account of the moment they met, and it says that the boy who had been so grave and so careful all his life took one look at her and was gone. They were married on Palm Sunday at Burgos in the April of 1497, and here is what happened next. And it is the thing that has been laughed about for 500 years, and I want to handle it carefully, because there is a young man's death inside the joke. They adored each other. That much is not in doubt. The court noticed at once that the prince and his wife were inseparable, that he could not be got out of her rooms, that the 2 of them were behaving like what they were, which was a pair of teenagers in love with the whole world in front of them. And the physicians went to the Queen. There is a report of it, and it is a strange and rather awful document. The doctors told Isabella that her son was frail, that the intensity of the marriage was consuming him, that he should be separated from his wife for a time, for his health. And Isabella of Castile, the most decisive woman in Europe, refused. She said, in effect, that what God had joined man must not put asunder, and she would not come between a husband and a wife. In the October of that same year, half a year married, Juan fell ill at Salamanca. His father rode to him. It was quick, a fever, 4 days, and he was dead on the 4th of October, at 19. The physicians said, and Europe repeated it, and it has been repeated ever since, that the marriage had killed him, that he had loved his wife to death. I do not believe it, and I do not think you should either. 19-year-old men do not die of happiness. What we have is a slight, frail boy who caught something in an age with no antibiotics, in a country where fevers carried off the strong and the weak alike, and a court that needed an explanation for the unthinkable, and reached for the nearest one, which was, as it always is, a young woman's body. Look at the shape of it. The heir of Spain is dead, and it must be somebody's fault, and there is a 17-year-old foreign girl in his bed. It is the same accusation in a different costume that this evening keeps handing us. A woman is standing near a catastrophe. Therefore the woman caused the catastrophe, and the story is so satisfying that nobody checks. Margaret was pregnant. That is the last cruelty. She was carrying his child when he died, and everything, the whole of Spain, hung on that pregnancy for months, and in the December she was delivered of a daughter, stillborn. And so it was over. In 3 months the only son of Ferdinand and Isabella was gone, and his child with him, and the entire architecture of the family had to be rebuilt from the daughters outward. Juan's tomb is at Avila, and it is one of the loveliest things in Spain. White marble, the boy lying with his hands together, and his parents spent money on it that they did not have. His mother wrote a line afterwards that people have quoted ever since. She said that God had given him, and God had taken him, and that the Lord had given, and the Lord had taken away. She was saying the correct thing in the correct formula because she was a queen, and that is what you say. She was 46 years old, and she had 7 more years to live, and she never really lifted her head again. I want to stay with Margaret of Austria for 1 chapter, because she is the control experiment, and because what happened to her afterwards is the sharpest possible light to shine on the 4 Spanish sisters. She was 19 when it was over. Married at 17, widowed at 17, delivered of a dead child, and stranded in a foreign country whose entire future she had just failed to secure through no fault of her own, and she had already been through it once before. This is the part that beggars belief. Margaret of Austria had been sent to France at the age of 3 years old. She was betrothed to the French king's son, and the French, sensibly, wanted her raised on their soil, so that she would be French by the time she was old enough to marry. So she was handed over at 3, and brought up in the French royal household as the future Queen of France, and she was there for the whole of her childhood, and she was, by all accounts, adored. When she was 11, the French king jilted her. He wanted somebody else for better lands, and so he sent Margaret back. She was 11, and she had been raised from infancy to be the queen of that country, and they packed her up and returned her like an unwanted parcel, and it took 2 years to negotiate the terms of sending her home, because her dowry lands were in dispute. So by 19 she had been handed over as a toddler, raised as a queen, discarded, shipped back, married off, shipwrecked, widowed, and delivered of a dead child. And then Spain wanted to keep her. Of course they did. She was an asset. She was the emperor's daughter, and there was talk of finding her another Spanish husband. Margaret said no, and she went home. She married once more to the Duke of Savoy, and she loved him, and he died 3 years later, and she was 24 and a widow for the 2nd time. And her father tried to marry her off again to Henry VII of England, of all people, and she refused flatly, and this time nothing on earth would move her. She said she was finished with it. She had been married 3 times before she was 25 and buried 2 husbands, and she would not do it again, and so instead she governed. Her father made her regent of the Netherlands, and she ran that country in her own hands for most of the rest of her life and she was superb at it. She negotiated one of the great treaties of the century in person, sitting across a table from the mother of the King of France, in a set of talks that people afterwards called the Ladies' Peace because two women did it while their men were still posturing. She raised her nephew, who became the most powerful man in the world. She built a palace at Mechlin and filled it with painting and music and scholars. She also, and this is why she matters tonight, took in and educated a stream of clever young women, one of whom, 30 years later, would come home to England speaking French like a Frenchwoman and take Catherine of Aragon's crown off her head. But that is a different evening, and it is not Margaret's fault. Now look at the 4 Spanish sisters against her, because the comparison is the whole argument of this chapter. Margaret was given the same century, the same rank, the same trade in bodies and treaties. She was used more brutally than any of them, earlier than any of them, and she ended up governing a country for a quarter of a century, with her own court, in her own house, admired across Europe, dying in her bed with her affairs in order. What did she have that they did not? She was allowed to stop. That is all. That is the entire difference. When Margaret of Austria dug her heels in and said she would not marry again, her father, who was an emperor and not a soft man, eventually shrugged and gave her a job instead. Isabella of Castile did not shrug. When her eldest daughter said she would not marry again, she was made to. When Juana would not do as she was told, a word was found for her, and the word was mad. When Catalina would not do as she was told, 30 years and 1 country later, she was cut off from her child and left in the fens with the water in the walls. The Spanish sisters were never allowed to stop, and Margaret was, and that is the whole of it. It is not that she was cleverer, because she was not cleverer than Juana. Nobody was. It is that somebody let go of her. There is a footnote to Margaret and Spain that I cannot resist, because it closes a circle. Her brother Philip married Juana. So Margaret was the sister-in-law of the woman who would be locked in Tordesillas, and the aunt of the emperor who kept her there. And when Catherine of Aragon, decades later, was fighting for her marriage in England, and needed the emperor to intervene, one of the people in the room where those decisions got made was Margaret of Austria, who had once been married to Catherine's brother for 6 months when they were both children. Everybody in this story is inside the same house. That is what these dynasties were. One enormous family, married to itself, at war with itself, writing each other letters across a continent while their children died. And now we have to go back to Spain, to the autumn of 1497, where a queen has just buried her only son and is about to lose her eldest daughter, and where the future of the whole peninsula has come to rest, briefly and beautifully, on a baby boy who has not yet been born. For 2 years, everything that Ferdinand and Isabella had built rested on a baby called Miguel, and almost nobody has ever heard of him, and if he had lived the map of the world would look different tonight. Let me put the arithmetic in front of you, because it is astonishing. His mother was Isabella, the eldest daughter of Spain, dead an hour after his birth. His father was Manuel, King of Portugal, and that meant this child, in his cradle, in the August of 1498, was the heir to Castile, and the heir to Aragon, and the heir to Portugal. All of it. The whole peninsula, from the Atlantic to the Pyrenees, plus everything Spain had just started taking in the Americas, plus everything Portugal held in Africa and India and the sea routes east. 2 empires, 3 crowns, 1 baby. It was the thing Ferdinand and Isabella had been playing for since they married. It was the reason the eldest girl had been sent to Portugal in the first place, and sent again, in black, against her will. Every calculation, every treaty, every cruelty, all of it had been aimed at exactly this. One child holding the lot, and they got it. For 2 years, they had it. They swore him in Castile, and swore him in Aragon, where the lawyers had made such difficulty about his mother because she was a woman, and no difficulty at all about him because he was not. They sent for him. Isabella of Castile took her grandson into her own household and raised him herself, and I think that must have been one of the very few sources of comfort left to her, because her son was dead, and her eldest daughter was dead, and here was the small living answer to both. He died in the July of 1500 at Granada before his second birthday. Nobody knows of what. He was a baby in a century in which babies died. Now stop and look at the wreckage, because in 3 years this family has lost everything it had. 1497. October Juan, dead at 19. 1497. December Juan's daughter stillborn. 1498. August Isabella gone at 27, in childbirth, in front of her mother. 1500 July Miguel, not quite 2. 4 heirs in 3 years. The son, the son's child, the eldest daughter, and the grandson who was going to hold the world together. All of them gone, and their mother is 49, and has watched it happen from the same room each time. And the crown of Spain went to Juana. That is the sentence. Everything after this, all of it, the Habsburgs in Madrid, the Spanish Empire, the wars of the following age, the whole shape of Europe, comes from the fact that a toddler died at Granada in that summer, and the inheritance skipped sideways to a young woman in Flanders who was married to a Habsburg. If Miguel had lived, Spain and Portugal are one kingdom. There is no separate Portuguese empire. The Habsburgs are not in Madrid. Charles, born in that same summer, is not the master of half the world. Almost nothing about the next 4 centuries is the same. And I want you to notice what it does to the women in this story, because that is what I actually want you to take away. Juana had been sent to Flanders as a spare. 3rd child, 2nd daughter, worth a treaty, and not much more, married into the emperor's family to make a fist around France. She was not going to be a ruling queen. That had never been the idea. She had a brother and an elder sister, and that sister's baby son, all standing in front of her. She had been sent abroad precisely because she was not needed at home. And then, one by one, everybody in front of her died, and by the summer of 1500, a woman who had been raised to rule and then married off into decoration was suddenly the heir to the whole of Spain. And she was in a foreign country, married to a man who could now see quite clearly that his wife was a throne with legs. Everything that happened to Juana afterwards, all of it, the accusations and the imprisonment and the 46 years, begins there. She became valuable. There is nothing in this world more dangerous for a woman in that century than to be the way somebody else gets a crown. There is one more thing about that catastrophic 3 years, and then we will go north to Flanders. Watch what it did to the youngest. Catalina was 11 when her brother died, 12 when her eldest sister was lost in childbirth, and 14 when her nephew went at Granada. She was in that household, in those rooms, for all of it. She watched her mother, the woman who took Granada, absorb 4 deaths in 3 winters without ever once letting the mask slip in public, and go on governing. And then, at 15, they put her on a ship. She had learned, by then, exactly 2 things about what it means to be born into this family. The first is that God's will is not to be argued with, and you carry what you are given, and you do not complain in front of the servants. The second is that you go where you are sent, whatever it costs, because the country needs it. She would live by both of those for the next 35 years, and one of them would make her magnificent, and the other one would nearly destroy her. And in the end, at the very end, when the King of England told her to go where she was sent, she would look at him and say no, but first Flanders, because Juana had gone north long before any of this, at 16. What was done to her there is the piece of this family that history has handled worst of all. Juana of Castile was sent north in the autumn of 1496 at 16 in a fleet of 120 ships, and she never came home the same person, and the world has called her mad for 5 centuries. Let me go slowly. This is the tale that has been told with less care than any other in that family, and possibly in that whole age. Start with the crossing, because nobody ever mentions it. It was enormous. A fleet the size of an invasion, 20,000 people, because the point was to show the North exactly how rich Spain now was. It sailed in the autumn into the Bay of Biscay, which is the wrong sea to be crossing in that season, and it was hammered. Ships were lost, people drowned, they were driven into English harbours to shelter, and a girl of 16 who had never left her mother's household arrived in Flanders after weeks of that, seasick, exhausted, in a country where the food was strange and the light was grey and nobody spoke her language, and her husband was not there to meet her. That is not a small thing. Philip, called the Handsome, was off elsewhere and did not trouble to come. She was left to wait in a foreign town in the wet for days until he could be bothered. And then he arrived, and they looked at one another, and by every account something happened in that room that neither of them had planned. They sent for a priest immediately. They would not wait for the formal ceremony. They were married then and there, that same day, and went to bed. So it began with something real, and I want that on the record, because the tradition has decided that Juana was a hysteric who fixated on an indifferent man, and the beginning was not that at all. The beginning was mutual, sudden and physical, and then he was unfaithful, constantly, publicly, and immediately. That was, I have to say, entirely normal. Every prince in Europe did it, including her own father, who had illegitimate children Isabella of Castile had to house. It was not the infidelity that made the story. It was that Juana would not do the one thing her position absolutely required, which was to look the other way and smile. She raged. She wept. There is a report that she attacked one of his mistresses and cut off the woman's hair. She would not eat when he was away. She would not come out of her rooms. She would not perform the serene public wife. She fought with his advisers. She fought with him. She refused to attend things, and the Flemish court, which had wanted a Spanish alliance and an ornament, decided that she was unbalanced. Now, was she ill? I want to give you the honest position, because I am not going to pretend I know. It is possible. There is madness in that family. Her grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, spent her last decades in a castle at Arevalo out of her wits, and Isabella of Castile had grown up visiting her. It is not fantasy to wonder about an inheritance. And some of the reported behaviour is genuinely frightening. The refusal to eat, the refusal to speak for days, the fixation. But look at the shape of what we have. Everything we know about Juana's mind comes from people with a direct financial and political interest in her being incapable. Her husband wanted to rule Castile in her name. A mad wife is a crown you can hold. Her father wanted to rule Castile after her mother's death. A mad daughter is a crown you can hold. Her son intended the same thing later, for 4 decades. A mad mother is a crown you can hold. 3 men, in sequence, each of whom got a kingdom out of the diagnosis. That is not evidence. That is a motive with a witness statement attached. And put beside it what she actually did. When her mother died and Juana became Queen of Castile in her own right, she was not incoherent. She refused to sign things she disagreed with, and she was right to refuse them. She held out. When her husband and her father were carving her kingdom up between them behind her back, she declined to cooperate with either. She said at one point that she was the queen and the crown was hers, and she would exercise it herself. And every time she said that, a report went out that she was worse. Consider the alternative reading. Take a girl of 16, send her to a cold country, marry her to a charming, faithless, ambitious man, cut her off from her language and her family, and give her no money of her own. Get her pregnant 6 times, tell her that her feelings are a symptom. Then, when her mother dies and she becomes a queen, have her husband, her father, and eventually her son all announce that the throne she has just inherited is beyond her capacity, and lock her up when she objects. I put it to you that a completely sane woman would look, from the outside, exactly like that. She was not helped by having no allies. Her mother-in-law was dead. Margaret, who might have been a friend, was in Spain and then in Savoy. Her mother was 1,000 miles away and dying, and the letters, which are the one thing we have, are edited by the very men who were reporting her madness. She had 6 children in 10 years, and every one of them lived, and every one of them was a king or a queen of somewhere, 2 Holy Roman emperors, and 4 consorts of European thrones. Whatever was happening to her, her body did not fail, and her children did not die, and no other woman in this family can say that. Her eldest son was born in Ghent in the February of 1500, in a privy, apparently, because she would not leave a ball, and he grew up to be Charles, master of half the world, and he kept his mother in a locked house for the last 38 years of her life. And that is the woman who was Catherine of Aragon's sister. Hold that. When Catherine, in England, decades later, appealed to the emperor to save her marriage, she was writing to her sister's son, and her sister was in a room in Tordesillas with the shutters closed, and Catherine never once, so far as we know, asked him to let her out. Nobody did. Everybody left her there. Now let us go and find the other sister, the one nobody talks about at all, because she did exactly what she was told, and it worked, and the reward for that was to be forgotten completely. Maria is the one nobody writes about, and she did everything right, and she got 9 children, and a good marriage, and 35 years of peace, and she is completely forgotten, and I think there is something in that worth sitting with tonight. She was born in the June of 1482, in the middle of the Granada War, and she had a twin sister who did not survive, and that is almost the last dramatic thing that ever happened to her. Here is her whole life, and I am going to give it to you plainly first and then argue with it. She was raised in the same schoolroom as the others, with the same Latin and the same scholars, and there is not one anecdote about her from any of it. When her eldest sister died in childbirth in 1498, Portugal had a widowed king with a dead Spanish wife and a treaty that had not yet done its work, and so Spain offered him the next one. Maria was married to Manuel in 1500 at 18 and went to Lisbon and stayed there for 17 years and had 10 children, of whom 9 lived, which in that century is barely credible. She ran her household, she endowed monasteries, she paid for hospitals, she was not involved in politics in any way that anybody noted. She died in 1517 at 35, worn out, having been pregnant for most of her adult life. Her husband remarried within a year to her niece, which was that century all over. That is it. That is the whole account. Now let me tell you what is underneath it. She married her dead sister's husband. Understand what that is. Manuel had wanted Isabella for years, pursued her, made a nation-sized concession to get her, and she had married him in mourning for another man and was dead inside 12 months. And then Spain sent her little sister, at 18, into that house, into that bed, to be the second Spanish Queen of Portugal inside a decade, and she was there partly to be a wife and mostly to be a continuation of a treaty that had already killed one of her family. And she got on with it. There is no letter of complaint. There is no scene. There is no Foyt she went, and she married him, and she gave him 9 living children, one of whom would be King of Portugal, one of whom married the Emperor and produced the next King of Spain, and one of whom was a cardinal who eventually ruled Portugal himself. Her descendants are on the throne of half of Europe within 2 generations. In dynastic terms, she was the most successful of the 4 sisters by an enormous distance, and she is a footnote. Because the tradition wants drama, we remember the one who was locked up and the one who fought a king. Maria did neither, so there is nothing to say about her, and so nothing is said. But I want to put the case for her gently, because it is a real one. Look at what she avoided. She was not humiliated. She was not called insane. She was not stripped of her children. She was not left to die in a damp house at the end of a road with 2 servants and a bishop she did not trust. She had a husband who, by all accounts, treated her decently, a country that accepted her, an income, a court, work she thought was worth doing, and children she raised herself and watched grow up. Of the 5 of them, Maria had the only life you would actually choose. And she got it by doing exactly what her mother and her century told her to do, without arguing, and I am uncomfortable about that, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. It is not a tidy moral. It sits badly next to everything else this evening wants to say. The sister who submitted completely was the sister who was happy. The 2 who resisted were destroyed. That is what the record shows, and I am not going to bend it because I would prefer it to say something more inspiring. But hold this next to it, because it is the honest other half. Maria was never asked to submit to anything monstrous. That is the difference, and it is the whole difference. She was asked to go to Portugal and be a queen and have children, and she wanted, so far as we can tell, to be a queen and have children, and so obedience cost her nothing that she was not willing to pay. Juana was asked to hand over a kingdom that was hers by right and to pretend that her own mind was broken. Catherine was told to say that her marriage of 20 years had been a sin and that her daughter was a bastard. Those are not the same request. Those 2 women did not resist because they were temperamentally difficult. They resisted because they were told to sign away the one thing they could not sign away, and Maria never faced it. The test never came for her. That is not a criticism. Not everybody gets tested, and the ones who do not are luckier, and there is nothing shameful in a life that was simply allowed to happen. She died in the March of 1517, and there is no drama in it either. She had been ill. She was worn through. She was 35, and had been pregnant more or less continuously since she was 18. 10 pregnancies in 17 years. Her body did what bodies did. And in England, some weeks after, a courier handed a packet to a queen of 31, who had not laid eyes on her sister since they were children, and she read that there was 1 more of them gone. That is how it came to Catherine. Always. In writing, weeks late, alone, in a language she had learned as an adult, in a country where there was nobody who had known any of them. Her brother, when she was 11, her eldest sister, the year after that, her nephew Miguel, at 14, her mother, at 18, her father, at 30, and now Maria, at 31. Every single one of them, by letter, across the sea. And the only one left was Juana, who was above the Duero behind a shut door, and who could not have written to her even if anybody had allowed it. Now let us go back and put the youngest on that ship, because we have left her standing on a quay at 15 for long enough, and everything you have ever heard about her starts here. Catherine of Aragon left Spain in the August of 1501, at 15, and she never saw her mother, her father, her country, or any member of her family again for the rest of her life. I want to sit in that sentence for a moment before we go on, because it is said so lightly in the histories, and it is the largest fact about her 35 more years of life, every one of them in England. Not one visit home, not once, not ever. Her mother died, and she could not go. Her father died, and she could not go. Her sister died, and she could not go. She was 15 when she said goodbye, and she was never in the same room as a person who had known her as a child again, except for a handful of servants who came with her, and most of those were sent away almost at once. The voyage itself was a foretaste. They sailed in August. They were driven back by storms into a Spanish port and had to wait. They sailed again and were battered across the Bay of Biscay, and she was sick the whole way, and they made land at Plymouth in the October, and came ashore in the rain to a country where nothing looked or smelled or tasted like anything she had known. And England, to be fair to it, went mad for her. That is the part that gets forgotten. The English adored her from the moment she landed. They had been told she was coming for 13 years. She was the great prize, the Spanish alliance, the proof that this new dynasty, this Tudor family who had taken the crown in a battle and had no royal blood worth the name, was accepted by the oldest monarchy in Europe. Henry VII, who was not a warm man, could not wait. He rode out and intercepted her on the road because he could not bear not to see her, and made her come out and be looked at, which broke every rule of Spanish etiquette and horrified her chaperones. They put on a wedding in November at St. Paul's that London talked about for 50 years. Pageants in the streets, wine in the conduits, a raised walkway the length of the nave so that the whole city could see her walk. She wore a Spanish gown with a hooped skirt, which the English had never seen, and the fashion crossed the court almost at once. And her husband was Arthur, Prince of Wales, and he was 15, and he was a decent, studious, slightly delicate boy who had also been raised since infancy to marry her. They had been writing to each other since childhood, in Latin, because it was the only language they had in common. Think about that. 2 children on opposite ends of Europe conducting a formal correspondence in a dead language about a marriage neither of them had any say in, and being perfectly polite and rather sweet about it. And then he was dead. They were sent to Ludlow, on the Welsh border, in the winter, which was where the Prince of Wales was supposed to hold court, and it is a cold, wet, remote castle in a cold, wet, remote country, and something came through it in the spring, a sweat or a fever, nobody knows what. It took him in April. It took her too, nearly. She was gravely ill at the same time, and could not be told for some days that her husband was gone. 5 months. She had been married for 5 months. She was 16 years old, in a castle in the Welsh Marches, in April, with her husband dead in the next room and no idea what happened to her now. And then came the 7 worst of her life, and they are the ones nobody tells, and I want to give them to you properly, because the woman who walked into that courtroom in 1529 was forged here and nowhere else. Here is the problem. She was a widow with a dowry. Half of it had been paid, half of it had not, and Henry VII, who was the most careful man with money who ever sat on the English throne, was not going to hand back the half he had, and Ferdinand of Aragon had no intention of paying the rest. So the 2 of them settled in to haggle, and the object being haggled over was a 16-year-old girl in a foreign country, and they kept it up for 7 years. She was not sent home. She was not married to the new heir, the boy Henry. Although that was the obvious solution, and was even agreed in principle, she was kept, parked, held in England as security, because as long as she was there, the dowry question was open, and neither king would blink. And so she lived in Durham House, and then wherever they put her, on an allowance that was not paid, with a household she could not afford, selling her own plate to buy food. That is not a figure of speech. She wrote it down. She wrote to her father that she had nothing, that her servants were in rags, that she had sold her plate and her jewels to feed them. She was ill, repeatedly. She had no money for a physician. She was reduced at one point to writing that she had not had a new gown in years. The daughter of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, hungry, in a house in London, at 21, being used as a chip in a negotiation between the two men who were supposed to love her. Her father made her his ambassador, which sounds like an honour, and was in fact the cheapest possible option. It meant Spain did not have to pay a real ambassador, because the girl was already there and desperate. So she was the first female ambassador in European history, at 22, in a hostile court, with no money, negotiating on behalf of a father who was lying to her in every letter. And she held. That is the whole point of these 7 years. She did not go home. She did not break. She did not marry elsewhere. She did not stop writing. She learned English. She learned the court. She learned exactly what Henry VII was and exactly what he wanted, and she found out that her own father would sell her without a second thought, and that nobody was coming. 7 of those, from 16 to 23. You cannot understand what she does later, at 40, on her knees in front of a king in a public courtroom, unless you have this. She had already been abandoned once, in that country, and survived it, and she knew exactly how far she could be pushed, because she had been pushed further than that before her 24th birthday, and had not moved. And in the middle of it all, while she was selling her plate to pay her servants, a courier came up from the coast with the worst letter of her life. Isabella of Castile died on the 26th of November, 1504, at Medina del Campo, and everything in this family that was still standing fell over within the year. She was 53. She had been ill for a long time, and the illness has never been identified. There was fever and dropsy and a thirst nobody could satisfy, and a slow failing over months. Her husband was with her. She had asked in her will to be buried in Granada, in the city she had taken, in a plain habit, in a simple tomb, and she specified that if the king wished to be buried elsewhere she would be moved to lie beside him, because she was not going to make even her own grave a point of pride. They carried her body south through Castile in the winter, in appalling weather, roads washed out, rivers up, the whole cortege crawling. It took weeks. The most powerful woman in the world going to Granada in the rain. Now, the will. I want to spend a moment on it, because it is one of the most extraordinary documents of that century, and it tells you exactly what she had understood by the end. She left Castile to Juana. Not to her husband, to her daughter, absolutely and by right, because Castile went by blood, and Juana was the blood. That is the law, and Isabella followed it. And then she added a clause, and the clause is the whole tragedy in one sentence. She said that if Juana were absent from the kingdom, or if she were present but unable or unwilling to govern, then Ferdinand should govern in her place, unable or unwilling. Read that again and see what it does. She was trying to protect the kingdom from a Flemish takeover. Her son-in-law Philip was circling, and she despised him, and she knew perfectly well that if he got Castile, he would run it for Burgundy. So she built in a lock, and the lock she built was a door marked incapacity, standing open, next to her daughter's throne. Every man who wanted Castile for the next 50 years walked straight through it. Her husband first, then her son-in-law, then her grandson. Unable or unwilling was the legal instrument by which Juana of Castile was removed from her own crown and put in a house, and her mother wrote it, and I do not for 1 second think she meant it that way, and it does not matter at all what she meant. There is one more thing in that will, and this one is to her credit, and it is enormous. She wrote about the New World, and about the peoples her ships had found there, and she instructed, explicitly, that they were to be treated well and justly, that they were not to be wronged in their persons or their goods, and that any injury done to them was to be remedied. It was ignored comprehensively within months of her death, and the century that followed was what it was. But she wrote it down, and she meant it, and the men who ignored it knew exactly what she had said. She died on a Tuesday, and Ferdinand said afterwards that the world had lost its brightest ornament, and he meant it too, whatever else that marriage was, and it was hard and it was political and he was unfaithful. The two of them had been in it together for 35 years, and he was never the same man afterwards either. And now watch what happens to the daughters. In England, a girl of 18 is living in a house she cannot pay for, waiting on a marriage that has been suspended for 2 years, and her entire value has just collapsed. That is the brutal fact, and nobody said it out loud. Catalina's worth in the English marriage market was the Spanish alliance, and the Spanish alliance was Castile and Aragon together, and now Castile had gone to Juana, and Ferdinand had only Aragon, which was much less interesting. Henry VII could do arithmetic. Overnight, the Spanish princess in his keeping was worth less, and the negotiations, which had been slow, became glacial, and the money stopped, and the young widow went from being neglected to being nearly destitute. Her mother's death made her poor. That is the mechanism, and it is grotesque, and she must have understood it perfectly. In Flanders, a woman of 25 has just become Queen of Castile, and her husband has just become the most dangerous person in her life. And in Portugal, Maria has just had her 4th child, and hears the news 2 weeks late, and orders masses, and that is all we know. I want to end this chapter with a small thing, because it says more than the politics. When Isabella was dying, the one child of hers who was in the country was nobody. Juana was in Flanders, Catalina was in England, Maria was in Lisbon, Juan and Isabella were in their tombs. She had 5 children, and she died with none of them in the house. She had dragged them across a war zone rather than be parted from them when they were small. She had kept them in her household when every custom of the age told her to send them away. And then she had spent them, one by one, on the map, and at the end there was nobody to sit with her. She did that herself. She knew it. And the will she wrote in her last weeks, with its careful clauses and its instruction about the Indians and its lock on her daughter's throne, is the work of a woman who understood exactly what her own certainty had cost and did not for one moment believe she had been wrong. 2 years later, her son-in-law Philip was King of Castile in his wife's name, and then he was dead too, and Juana was on the road with his coffin, and the story that has followed her for 500 years was about to be written. Philip the Handsome died at Burgos on the 25th of September, 1506, at 28, and what his widow did afterwards is the single most famous thing about her, and almost every version you have heard of it is wrong. Start with the year, because it was a savage one, and it explains the state she was in. Juana had come to Spain with her husband in the spring to claim her mother's kingdom, and the whole of that journey and everything after it was a slow campaign, conducted by her husband and her father together, to establish that she could not rule. They agreed it between themselves at Villafafila, in a treaty, in the summer. The 2 men signed a document declaring that Juana was incapable, and dividing her inheritance between them, and her father then quietly signed a protest saying he had only agreed under duress and would come back for it later. Her husband and her father sat down and signed a paper saying that she was mad. Neither of them was in the room with her when they did it. It was a property arrangement. She fought it. She would not sign. There is a lovely, terrible detail. When they wanted her assent to something, she developed a technique of simply refusing to speak, or refusing to be present, or agreeing, and then declining to put her name to it. And every time she did it, another dispatch went out saying that her behaviour was disordered. And then, in September, Philip caught a fever after a game of ball at Burgos, and he was dead in a week, and Juana of Castile, at 26, was a widow, 5 months pregnant with her 6th child, in a country she had not lived in since she was 16, surrounded by 2 nationalities of men who had spent a year telling everybody she was insane. Now, the coffin. Here is what actually happened. She had his body embalmed, and she kept it, and in the December she set out with it from Burgos to take it to Granada, because he had said he wished to be buried there, and because Granada was where her mother lay. The journey took months. They travelled at night. She would not let the coffin out of her keeping. She had it opened at least once, and there are reports of her looking at the body. And here is what has been done with that. It became one of the great Gothic stories of Europe. The mad queen, dragging her husband's corpse around Spain, kissing his feet, refusing to let any woman near the coffin out of jealousy, opening it to embrace him, wandering the roads by night in a black veil for years and years. It is in paintings. There is a famous 19th century canvas of it, vast, in Madrid, and it has done more to fix her reputation than any document ever written. Now let me give you the plain reading. Every royal death in Spain was handled that way, embalmed, escorted, moved slowly to the chosen church. 400 miles across Castile in winter is a matter of months, and you go by dark because in that country you shift the dead in the cool, which any muleteer could have told the painters. And the lid came off because a body had to be identified in front of witnesses. That was law, and the record of it reads exactly like the piece of paperwork it was. She was also pregnant, and gave birth on that journey, in January, in a village, to a daughter, and got up, and went on. Was she in a bad state? Almost certainly. Her husband, who she had loved and fought and been humiliated by for 10 years, had died at 28 without warning. Her mother had been 2 winters in the ground. Her father was on his way back to take her kingdom. She was pregnant and alone and had just discovered that every man in her life had signed a paper saying her mind was gone. Grief is not a diagnosis. A woman who takes her husband's body to the grave he asked for, at the pace such a journey takes, while pregnant, in the middle of a political coup against her, is not evidence of insanity. It is evidence of a woman doing the one thing left that she was allowed to control. And that is exactly what it was. Look at it that way, and the whole picture inverts. Everything else had been taken from her, the crown, the council, the treasury, her own children, who were in Flanders. The one thing nobody could take was that body and the promise attached to it. So she held it, and she moved slowly, and she did not hurry, because as long as she was on that road, she was doing something that was hers. She got him to Granada eventually, in the summer, and then her father came home from Aragon, and she went to meet him, and there is an account of that meeting. She came out to him, and she knelt, and he raised her up, and the imperial ambassador wrote that she seemed perfectly composed and spoke well. And her father took the kingdom, using the door her mother had left standing open in the will, and then, in the February of 1509, he had his daughter conveyed to a house in a small town on the Duero called Tordesillas. She was 29 years old. She came out of that house exactly twice in the next 46 years. Both times somebody else had put her in a cart. Juana of Castile was queen of that country in law for 51 years, and for 46 of them she was locked in a house on a riverbank at Tordesillas, and every document of state in Spain went out in her name while she was in there. I want to describe the place, because it is the setting for half a lifetime. Tordesillas is a small town on the Duero, in the flat wheat country of Old Castile. There is a royal residence there, next to a convent, standing above the river, and it is not a dungeon. That has to be said. It was a palace. She had rooms and servants and food and a chapel. She had her youngest daughter with her, the baby born on the coffin journey, who was raised in there and who did not go outside either until she was a young woman. And it was a prison. She could not leave. She could not go into the town. She could not have visitors her keepers had not chosen. Her letters, when she was permitted any, were read. She had no money of her own, no counsel, no access to her own kingdom's business, and no lawyer. Her father put her there in 1509 and kept her in it until he died. And then her son took over, and Charles, who was 17 and had been raised in Flanders and had not laid eyes on her since he was a small boy, came to Spain to be king. And here is the fact that tells you everything about that arrangement. He could not be king legally while his mother lived, because the crown of Castile was hers. So they arrived at the formula that he would rule alongside her, in her name as her co-monarch, which meant in practice that he ruled and she stayed in the house. He visited her. He was, by the accounts, moved by it. And he did not let her out. And he did not let her out for the next 39 years, and every year of it he signed documents under her name. Now, was she mad? By the end, after decades in there, quite possibly. That is what that does to people. But the most interesting evidence in the whole business comes from the one moment when somebody actually asked her. In 1520, the towns of Castile rose in revolt. It is called the Revolt of the Comuneros, and it was a serious, popular, well-organized rebellion against a foreign-raised king and his Flemish courtiers, and the rebels marched on Tordesillas and took the house and opened the doors, and found their queen. And they knelt to her. They told her that the kingdom was hers, that it had been stolen, that they would restore her, that all she had to do was sign. And they talked to her at length over weeks. Their leaders came and sat with her, and their reports of those conversations do not describe a lunatic. They describe a woman who was cautious, who asked good questions, who understood exactly what was being proposed, who said she had been badly treated, and who then would not sign. She would not put her name to anything against her son. She let them come, and she listened, and she withheld the one thing they needed. Some historians think that was madness or paralysis. I think it is the single sanest act in this entire evening. Look at the position. If the rising failed, and it did fail, everyone who had signed would be executed, and she would be blamed and buried alive in that house for good. If it succeeded, she would be a figurehead for an army against her own child. She was being asked to bet her life on a rebellion by men she had met 3 weeks earlier. She said no. The revolt was crushed the following year. Its leaders were beheaded, and Juana went back into the house, and the doors were shut, and this time they did not open for 34 years. Her conditions got worse afterwards. Of course they did. She had been a rallying point. She could never be allowed to be one again. The reports from the last decades are ugly. She would not eat. She would not change her clothes. She would not see priests, which convinced everybody that she had lost her faith, and the Inquisition took an interest, and there were suggestions of treatment which in that century meant beating. She was 75 when she died, on the 12th of April, 1555, having been in that house since she was 29. Now I want to hold her up next to her sister for a moment, because this is the pivot of the whole evening, and everything after this is the two of them. In 1531, when Catherine of Aragon was fighting for her marriage in England, and being told to sign a paper saying that her 20-year union was no marriage at all, her sister Juana was sitting above the Duero, having refused for 22 years to sign a paper saying that her crown was not her crown. 2 sisters, 2 documents, 2 refusals. Neither of them ever knew what the other was doing. They are the same woman in 2 countries. That is what I want you to see. trained by the same tutors, in the same schoolroom, by the same mother, to believe that a right is a right, and that what God has given no man may take. And both of them were handed a pen by the men who owned their lives, and both of them on their own, without allies, without lawyers, without any prospect of winning, said no, and went on saying no until they died. One of them was called mad for it. The other one was called stubborn, and then obstinate, and then, in the end, by her enemies, a saint. And the difference between those two words is not in the women. It is in what the men who wrote the reports needed to be true. Now, let us go back to England, where it is 1509, and the old king is dead, and something is about to happen to Catalina that nobody in Europe expected. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon in the June of 1509, 6 weeks after his father died before his own coronation, and he did it because he wanted to, and everybody told him not to. I want to make sure you feel the size of that, because the whole of the rest of her life is the falling away from it. She was 23 and she had been in that country for 8 years. She was a widow. Her dowry was still unpaid. Her value had collapsed when her mother died. She had been ill, hungry, cut off, and passed over. There had been an English betrothal to the young prince, and it had been formally repudiated by the boy himself, on his father's instruction, on the day before his 14th birthday, in a legal ceremony designed to keep every option open. She had been in England long enough to become an embarrassment. The old King's Council wanted a French match or a Habsburg one, or anything with money attached. There was no political case left for the Spanish marriage. None. And the boy was 18, and he had just inherited the throne and the treasury and the whole of England, and he married her within weeks quietly at Greenwich, and then put a crown on her head next to his own at Westminster 13 days later, in front of everybody, and told the world he had done it for love. He said so. He wrote it in letters. He told her father's ambassador that even if he were free, he would choose her above all others. Now, was it love? It was something. He had known her since he was 10. She had married his brother while he stood and watched, and she had been on the edge of that court ever since, while he grew up looking at her. She was 17 and dazzling when he first saw her, and he was a child, and by the time he was 18 and free, she was the one thing in England he had wanted for as long as he could remember, and had been told he could not have. And there is a colder reading available, and it is probably also true. He was 18, he had just inherited a throne, and marrying her was the loudest possible way of announcing that he was not his father. His father had been careful, mean, calculating, unromantic, and had haggled over this woman for 7 years like a man arguing over a horse, and the son took the throne and married her in a month, on his own authority, against the council, for love. Every young king needs a first act. That was his. Whatever it was, look at what she got. For the first half of that marriage, Catherine of Aragon was one of the most powerful queens England has ever had. And this is the part that gets erased entirely by everything that came later. She was his partner. Really, not decoratively. He was 18 and had been raised in seclusion by a suspicious father, and she was 23 and had been a working diplomat in that court for 6 years and knew every man in it. She had been her father's ambassador. She knew the Spanish position, the papal position, the French position. She had watched Henry VII govern from very close range in circumstances that taught her exactly what he was. So he leaned on her, and she pushed, and for years English foreign policy was substantially the policy she and her father wanted. Her rooms were the centre of the court. She was on the council in all but name. The Venetian ambassadors, who were the best reporters in Europe, wrote about her with real respect. And she made that court into something. She brought the new learning in with her. Erasmus was at her table. Thomas More was her friend, and his household became the most famous educational experiment in England, the one where the daughters were taught precisely as the sons were. And I do not for a moment think it is a coincidence that it happened in the England of a queen who had been taught by Beatriz Galindo. She dressed like a Spaniard, and the court copied her. She spoke 4 languages. She was, by all accounts, warm. She was liked. People who came into her service stayed for 3 decades and went to prison for her at the end. And she was beautiful. That gets forgotten too, because the only portraits most people have seen are of a tired woman past 40, in the middle of the worst decade of her life. At 23, she was small and round-faced, with a great deal of auburn hair, and the ambassadors said she was lovely, and the boy who married her had thought so since he was 10. So there it is, a young king who adored her, a court she had built, a people who liked her, the new learning at her table, and the business of the kingdom in her hands, and one thing missing, and it was the only thing that had ever been required of her. We are going to have to walk through that, because it is a corridor of small graves and it went on for a decade, and it is the machine that broke everything. But before we do, I want to give you the single best day of her life, and it is not the wedding, and it is not the coronation. It is the 9th of September, 1513, and she is 27, and she is heavily pregnant, and she is riding north in armour at the head of an English army, while her husband is off playing at war in France, and she has just destroyed the Scots. In the summer of 1513, Henry VIII went to France to be a hero, and he left his wife governing England, and while he was away she raised an army, sent it north, and annihilated the Scots at Flodden, and then wrote him a letter about it. That is one of the most extraordinary documents of the century. It makes me want to put my head in my hands, because if you took this woman's life and cut it off at 30, you would have one of the great English queens, and every schoolchild would know her. Here is the situation. Henry was 22 and desperate to be Henry V. He took an army to France, spent a scandalous amount of money, and captured 2 towns, one of which was worth having. He was gone for months, and he left Catherine as regent and governess of England with full powers. That is not a courtesy title. She had the authority of the crown. She signed warrants. She sat with the council. She raised troops, ordered ordnance, arranged supply and money, and appointed commanders. And the Scots came over the border, as everybody knew they would, because France and Scotland had an alliance 3 centuries old, and this was exactly what it was for. King James IV of Scotland crossed with an enormous army, the largest that had ever come south, and Catherine of Aragon, pregnant at 27, went to work. And, being her mother's daughter, she went to work the way her mother had. She organised the supply. She got the standards made. There are payments in the accounts for banners. She had the artillery moved. And she got on a horse and rode north herself, in armour at the head of a reserve force, and made a speech to the troops on the way, and an eyewitness said she spoke to them with as much courage as any prince ever did, telling them that Englishmen had always beaten the Scots and that God would be on their side. Pregnant, in armour, on the North Road, making a battle speech in her 4th language. That is Isabella of Castile's daughter. And there is not one thing in that scene which is not a direct inheritance from a woman on a horse outside Granada. The Earl of Surrey caught the Scots at Flodden on the 9th of September and destroyed them. It is one of the most complete disasters in Scottish history. The king killed, and with him an archbishop, 2 bishops, 11 earls, 15 lords, and something like 10,000 men. A whole political generation of a country, gone in 3 hours in a bog. And then she wrote to her husband. Here is the thing about that letter. Everything in it is calculated to hand him the victory. She calls it a great victory that God has sent, and she is careful to say that the credit is his, that all this comes of his war, and that he has won more than he knows. She says she is sending him something. She had sent him the coat of the dead King of Scotland with his blood on it, so that he could have it as a banner in France. And then she says, and this is the line, that she had thought of sending him the body itself, but that the Englishmen's hearts would not suffer it. I want to make sure you have got that. The gentle, pious, dull first wife had considered posting her husband a corpse as a present, and only refrained because the men would not stand for it, and then wrote to tell him so, in a friendly tone, in her own hand, with the dead man's shirt in the parcel. That is who she was. That is the woman who spent 35 years in England being underestimated. And in the same letter, the very same letter, she nags him about his health, tells him not to overtire himself, and mentions that she is going on pilgrimage to Walsingham to give thanks, and she meant to pray there for a son now. Look at what that year was, because it is the hinge, and nobody sees it. The husband went to France and took a couple of towns at enormous expense. The wife stayed home and destroyed Scotland. His war was a pageant. Hers was the real one. And there is a story, which may or may not be true, but which the court certainly believed, that he was not entirely delighted about it. Weeks after Flodden, she lost the child, a son, born or miscarried in the autumn of that year, dead either way. That was the third. So put the two things side by side, because they belong to the same autumn. In the September, she is the most impressive person in that kingdom, governing it, winning its wars, standing in armour on the North Road. And in the October, she is in a room with a dead baby, again, and everything she has just done counts for absolutely nothing, because the only thing anybody actually required of her was one living boy, and she could not do it. She never held that kind of power again. There were more regencies in name, but never that. The court went on admiring her, and the arithmetic went on running underneath, silently, season after season, and it was going to kill her. But first, come with me into her rooms. I want to take you inside her rooms because we have spent this evening on treaties and deathbeds, and I have not yet shown you what her ordinary days were made of, and they are the reason the whole country loved her. Start with the women, because a queen's household was a small nation of women, and hers was famous for its steadiness. Some of them had come with her from Spain when she was 15, and a handful had refused to go home when the rest were sent back, and they were still at her elbow 3 decades later. One of them in particular never left, and you will meet her again at the very end of the evening, doing the bravest thing anybody in this story ever did for anybody else. That is not employment. There was something in that woman that made people stay, and stay, and stay. Her chambers themselves were not what the later story would have you imagine. They were not gloomy. She was a queen of the new fashion. There was music, and there were Spanish musicians in her pay, and there was dancing, and she liked it. She kept a fool. She played cards for money, and lost cheerfully. She had a menagerie's worth of small pets given to her. Her chambers were where the young women of the great English families were sent to be finished, because a season in Catherine of Aragon's service was a certificate of respectability that lasted a lifetime, and the mothers of England knew it, and queued, and the work. This is the part that gets laughed at, and I want to defend it, because the laughter is the whole misunderstanding of her. She sewed. She sewed constantly, and she was superb at it, and she ran a workshop of it. That is the detail that people use to prove she was dull. There is a famous jab, decades later, about the old queen sitting over her needlework while the new one danced. But look at what she was actually making. Her household turned out shirts for the poor by the 100. It turned out altar cloths and vestments for churches that could not afford them. Blackwork embroidery, which is the Spanish work in black silk on white linen that became the English fashion of that century, came into this country in her luggage and out of her rooms, and English women were still doing it. 100 years after she was dead. And she made her husband's shirts herself, by hand, with her own needle, all through the marriage, and she went on making them for years after he had begun the case against her, which the new queen found intolerable and said so, and Catherine went on doing it anyway. Read that whichever way you like. It is either the most loving thing in this story, or the most devastating piece of quiet warfare ever conducted with a needle, and it may very well be both. Then the money. She gave away, by the estimates of people who went through her accounts, an extraordinary proportion of her income, alms wherever she travelled, endowments, poor scholars at both universities. She founded a lectureship at Oxford. When Vives wrote his book on the education of a Christian woman, it was on her commission, and she then had a second one commissioned on how to teach her daughter, and the two of them together did more for the education of European women than any monarch of that century. And she heard petitions. That is not decorative either. Her rooms were an appeals court of a kind. People came to her when they could not get to him, and she went to him for them, and it worked often enough that everybody knew to try. Which brings me to the best day of it. In the May of 1517, London rioted. It is remembered as Evil May Day, and it was an ugly, xenophobic business. Apprentices and young men rampaging through the city, going for foreign merchants, breaking into their houses, wrecking their shops. It was put down hard, and the ringleaders were hanged, and then the government decided to make an example, and 400 prisoners, most of them boys, some of them children, were brought to Westminster Hall in their shirts with halters round their necks to be sentenced to death. Then 400, in their shirts, roped in front of the king, and Catherine of Aragon came in and went down on her knees in front of her husband, in public, with her hair loose, and begged for their lives. Understand what she was. She was Spanish. The riot had been against foreigners. It had been, in part, against people like her. Her own countrymen's shops had been broken open. Nobody could have blamed her for wanting the hangings. She knelt anyway, and asked for the boys, and Cardinal Wolsey knelt with her, and the king allowed himself to be persuaded, and 400 people were pardoned in that hall, and went home to their mothers, and the shout that went up was heard in the street outside. It was theatre, of course it was. Everybody in that hall knew that the mercy had been arranged in advance, and that this was how a merciful king demonstrated it, with a queen kneeling to give him a reason. And I do not care in the slightest, because the boys walked out. That is the woman England had for 2 decades. Hold her against the version you were given, because we are about to watch what was done to her, and none of it makes any sense unless you know that the country was hers. She was not the dull one. She was the beloved one, and the country never stopped. And that is precisely why the man who wanted her gone had to be so careful and so slow and so cruel about it. But that is 1517, and the sun is still on her. And a little over a year earlier, in Spain, her father had died, and I have to tell you about him, because he is the last piece of the family, and he treated her worse than anybody except her husband. Ferdinand of Aragon is the other half of that famous marriage, and by some distance the hardest to like, and he outlived his wife by 12 years, and in those 12 years he did more damage to his own children than any enemy ever managed. Take him at his best first, because he was formidable. He was a great king, in the technical sense of the trade. He was patient, subtle, endlessly deceitful, and almost always right about the outcome. Machiavelli, who was watching from Italy and knew a professional when he saw one, wrote about him with something close to admiration, and used him as the model of the new sort of prince, a man who talked constantly about faith and peace, and who, if he had actually kept either, would have lost half his kingdoms. He fought France for 3 decades and beat them in Italy. He took Naples. He held Aragon together which was a bundle of jealous provinces with a constitution designed to frustrate a king. He was in the field for a decade in the Granada War beside his wife, and he was good at it. And he had absolutely no sentimentality about people whatsoever, including the ones he had made. Watch what he did after Isabella died. His wife's crown went to Juana, and he was, by the terms of the will, only the regent, and only if his daughter was absent or unable. So he set about making sure she was one or the other, permanently. He signed the treaty with his son-in-law declaring her incapable, and then protested it in secret. When his son-in-law died, he took Castile back, and he put Juana in the house at Tordesillas, and he kept her there for 7 years until his own death, and he wrote instructions about her treatment, which are, when you read them, the instructions of a jailer. That was his daughter, not a rival, not a claimant. A widow of 29 with 6 children who happened to be standing on the thing he wanted. And he married again, inside 12 months of Isabella's death. She was Germaine of Foix, a French princess, and she was 18, and he was 53, and she was the niece of the King of France, and the point of the marriage was to detach France from the fight and to have a son, because a son of that marriage would take Aragon away from Juana and out of Habsburg hands for good. They had a boy in 1509, and he lived a few hours. He tried for years after that. There is a story, and it may be a story, that he was taking preparations to enable him to father another child, and that they finished him. He died in the January of 1516 in a village on the road, on his way to somewhere else at 63, and Spain went, exactly as he had spent a decade trying to prevent, to a Flemish boy who did not speak Spanish and who was his mad daughter's son. And now the part that concerns us tonight, which is what he did to Catalina. She was in England from 1501, and for the 7 bad years she wrote to him constantly. Those letters are painful reading. She tells him she has nothing. She tells him her servants are in rags and that she has sold her plate. She asks for the dowry to be paid, so that the marriage can go ahead and she can stop being a hostage. She addresses him with total formal devotion, and he strung her along, and we have seen what it did to her. What I want you to notice is the coldness of the calculation underneath it. He worked out that the English would not put her on a boat, whatever happened, and that therefore her suffering was free. It cost him nothing, so he spent it. And then, when she was queen and useful, he used her again. He made her his ambassador, on the cheap, and he leaned on her to push her young husband into a war with France. And she did it, and she was good at it. And in 1512 the English sent an army to Spain to fight the French alongside her father's forces. And her father used the English army as a decoy while he took Navarre for himself, and then made a private truce with France and left the English standing in the mountains, sick and drunk and mutinous. And they came home in disgrace, having achieved nothing. Her husband was humiliated in front of Europe, and the person who had assured him that her father was trustworthy was Catherine. That was the first crack in that marriage, and it never healed. Everything she had built with Henry in the first years, all that partnership, was founded on her being the reliable link to Spain, and her own father broke it deliberately for a province. She forgave him. Of course she did. He was all she had left, and she had been raised to believe that a daughter's duty did not depend on the father's conduct. She went on writing to him, and she mourned him properly when he died. But I want you to look at the count now. Her mother spent her on the map and never saw her again after she was 15. Her father sold her twice, once for a dowry and once for Navarre. Her husband put her aside for a woman half her age and told her that her babies had died because she was a sin. Her nephew, the emperor, was kind to her in principle, and did precisely as much as suited his policy, and no more. Every single man with power over Catherine of Aragon's life traded her, and she went on doing her duty by all of them, and the only people who ever stayed with her to the end were her women. There is a small thing at the end of Ferdinand's life that says everything. In his last years, ill and frightened, he made a will and unmade it, and made it again, and the crown went where it had to go, to the son of the daughter he had locked up. He had spent 12 years trying to prevent exactly that outcome, and he lost, and everything he had done to Juana was for nothing. She outlived him by 39 years in the room he had put her in. And in England, all through that same stretch, his youngest daughter was going into a confinement chamber over and over again, and coming out of it with nothing. Here is what that stretch of the marriage actually contained, and it is not comfortable listening. Between 1510 and 1518, Catherine of Aragon was pregnant at least 6 times, and 1 child lived. And I am going to take you through them, and then I am going to ask you to remember that every one of these was a person in a family who wanted them. The first was a girl, stillborn, in the January of 1510. She was 24. It was 7 months into the marriage, and the whole court had been waiting, and the thing was so badly handled that for weeks afterwards her physician insisted she was still carrying a twin, and she believed it, and she went into confinement again in the March, and there was nothing there. She had to come out and face them all. She wrote to her father about it, and the letter is careful and level, and asks him not to be angry. The second was a boy, and he lived, and for 52 days England went out of its mind with joy. He was born on New Year's Day, 1511, at Richmond, and he was called Henry, and he was the Prince of Wales, and the guns fired, and the bonfires went up, and the wine ran in the streets. His father held a tournament at Westminster that was the most extravagant thing that court had ever staged, and rode in it himself, under the name of Sir Loyal Heart, with her initial embroidered all over him. There is an illuminated roll of it, yards long, and you can see him in the lists, showing off, delighted, for his wife and his son. And they took the baby to Walsingham to give thanks, and he was dead by the end of February. 52 days. The third was a boy, born in the autumn of 1513, in the weeks after Flodden, and he did not live. The fourth was a boy, born in the December of 1514, and he did not live. The fifth arrived in the February of 1516, at Greenwich, a girl, and she lived, and her name was Mary, and she was the only one. And her father, when he was told, said the thing that people still quote, that they were both young, and if it was a girl this time, by the grace of God the sons would follow. He was 24 when he said it. He believed it. So did she. The sixth came in the November of 1518, a girl, and she did not live, and that was the last. Catherine was 32 years old, and there were no more. Now I want to stop and do something that the histories almost never do, which is to count what that actually was. 6 confinements in 8 years, 5 funerals, or something less than funerals, because a child who dies at birth in that century is not given much. She was pregnant or recovering for most of her 20s. Every single time, the whole of England was watching and counting the weeks. Every single time, a court and a country and a young husband were waiting for her to produce the one thing that justified her existence. And on 5 occasions out of the 6 she came out of that room with nothing. There is no privacy in it. That is the part I find hardest. A queen's confinement was a public event. The whole apparatus of the court knew the dates. The ambassadors reported the pregnancies to their masters in code. Every miscarriage she ever had was diplomatic news in 4 countries within a fortnight. She grieved in front of an audience over and over, and had to come out afterwards and be gracious about it. And she never complained, not in any surviving line. There is not one letter in which Catherine of Aragon says, "This is unbearable, and I cannot do it again." What she did instead was pray, and give money away, and go on pilgrimage, and wear a hair shirt under the cloth of gold, and conclude, because she had been raised by a woman who had absolutely no other explanatory framework available, that God was doing this, and that God had a reason. That is the thing you have to understand about her, and it is why she behaved as she did later. She never for 1 second thought that her marriage was cursed, because she knew, with the same certainty her mother had, that she was married, that God had made it. So when her husband eventually stood up and announced that all those dead babies were divine punishment for a sin, he was not making a theological argument to her. He was calling her mother a fool, and her marriage a lie, and her daughter a bastard, and her God a liar, all at once, and asking her to agree. And in the middle of the graves, the rest of the family finished dying. Her father went in the January of 1516, a month before Mary was born, and by the end he had spent the last decade cheerfully deceiving his daughter in every letter he sent her. She found out and forgave him because she had no one else. Her sister Maria went in the March of 1517, worn out in Lisbon at 35, and Juana was in the house at Tordesillas, alive, unreachable, technically queen of everything. So by 1518 the account stood like this. Of the 5 children of Ferdinand and Isabella, one was in a locked room in Castile, and one was in England. Both of their mother's parents were dead. Every brother and sister they had was in a tomb somewhere. And Catherine, at 32, had 1 daughter, no sons, no family, no country of her own, and a husband of 27 who was starting to think. What came next took the best part of a decade, and it was the most public humiliation ever inflicted on a woman in this country, and she fought it alone from the first day to the last, and very nearly won. In the spring of 1527, a court was quietly convened in secret at Westminster to determine whether the King of England was married, and nobody told his wife. That is how it started, and I want you to hold the manner of it, because the manner is the wound, 22 years. She had been his wife for 18 of them by that point, and had known him since he was 10, and he opened the case against her behind her back, in a room she was not invited to, and she found out from somebody else. Now the argument, I will give it to you straight, because it is not a stupid argument, and pretending it is does nobody any favours. There is a verse in the book of Leviticus which says that if a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, and they shall be childless. Henry had married his brother's widow. Henry had no sons. He read that verse, and he concluded, with the whole force of a conscience that had never in his life been inconvenienced by anything, that his marriage was cursed, that God was punishing him, and that the dead babies were the proof. And there is a verse in Deuteronomy which says the precise opposite, that a man has a duty to marry his brother's widow and raise up children for him. The Church had always read the two together, and had always held that the Pope could dispense, and a Pope had dispensed, in writing, in 1503, and everybody had proceeded on that basis for a quarter of a century. So the case was, the dispensation was invalid, therefore there had never been a marriage, therefore he had been living in sin since he was 18, therefore his daughter was illegitimate, and therefore he was free. And her answer was 1 sentence, and she never moved from it in 9 years, and it is the hinge of English history. She said she had come to Arthur a virgin, and that the marriage had never been consummated, and therefore Leviticus did not apply, because she had never in any sense been her brother-in-law's wife. Everything turns on that. If she was telling the truth, the whole case is a nonsense, and the dispensation was not even necessary. If she was lying, he had a point. Was she telling the truth? I think it is very likely, 2 16-year-olds, one of them a delicate boy who was dead within 5 months, a Spanish princess with an escort of duennas whose entire job was to know, and a woman who took the sacrament on it publicly, more than once with her soul in her hands, in a century when she believed absolutely that a false oath on the body of Christ meant hell for eternity. She had by then nothing left to lose but that, and she staked it, and she never wavered once in 9 years under the most extreme pressure ever applied to a woman in that country. And there is a small, awful piece of evidence on the other side, which is that Arthur is supposed to have come out of the chamber the next morning and made a joke to his friends about having been in the midst of Spain. Boys of 15 say things. 25 years later, men who wanted a job remembered him saying it. Now, the shape of the fight, because this is where she becomes magnificent. She was alone. Let me be precise about the loneliness. Her mother was dead. Her father was dead. Her brother and 2 of her sisters were in their tombs. Her one surviving sister was locked in a house in Castile and could not have helped her fly. She was in a foreign country, married to its king, opposed by his chief minister, and every English lawyer and cleric of any ambition had already worked out which way the wind was going. She had one card, and it was an extraordinary one. Her nephew, Charles, the Emperor, master of Spain and the Netherlands and the Americas and half of Italy, the most powerful man in the world, was her sister Juana's son. Sit with the arithmetic of this family for a moment. The woman in the locked room in Tordesillas was the mother of the man who held Europe, and Catherine in England appealed to that man, and he answered because she was his aunt, and because the honour of Spain was in it. And in the May of 1527, in one of the most stupefying coincidences in history, the emperor's army, unpaid and out of control, sacked Rome, and the Pope ended up effectively a prisoner of the emperor. So Henry VIII needed a decision from a pope who was in the power of the nephew of the woman he was trying to divorce. That is why it took 9 years. That is why it broke the church. Everything after this, the whole English Reformation, all of it, happens because Clement VII could not say yes to England without a Spanish army walking into his rooms, and could not say no to England without losing a kingdom. And so, being a cautious man, he did what cautious men do, which was to say nothing at all for 6 years and hope somebody died. And she knew that. That is the thing. Catherine of Aragon was not clinging to a marriage out of sentiment. She was running a legal and diplomatic campaign, and she was running it well. She got her case referred to Rome. She got her nephew to apply pressure. She fought the jurisdiction of the English court on the ground that she could not get justice from her husband's own subjects, which was perfectly true, and which she said out loud. She had counsel, and she instructed them. She was fighting the King of England, the Cardinal of York, the entire English legal establishment, and eventually Parliament itself, from inside her husband's house in her 4th language, with no money of her own, and she held them off for 9 years. And she did it for one reason, and it was not love, though there was love in it once. She did it because if she conceded, her daughter was a bastard. Everything was for Mary. And on the 21st of June 1529, in a hall at Blackfriars, in front of 2 cardinals and the assembled nobility of England and her husband sitting up on a dais, she was called, and she stood up, and she did not go to the lawyer's table. She walked across the floor to where he was sitting, and she knelt at his feet. What she did at Blackfriars on that June day is the finest piece of theatre of the 16th century, and she was not acting, and it is worth doing slowly. Picture the room. A great hall fitted out as a court, the 2 legates on a raised bench under cloth of estate, Wolsey of England and Campeggio from Rome, an old man so crippled with gout that he had been carried in. The king on a canopied chair on one side raised up, a chair for the queen on the other, bishops, lawyers, officers, the nobility of England in the seats behind, and a crowd of Londoners pressed in wherever they could get. The crier called, "Henry, King of England, come into the court." And he answered from his chair, "Here, my lords." Then, "Catherine, Queen of England, come into the court." And she stood up, and instead of answering, she walked. Around the edge of the court, past the lawyers, past the bishops, in front of everybody, all the way round to where her husband was sitting, and she knelt down at his feet. He tried to raise her up. She would not be raised, and she made the speech, in English, in that accent she had never lost, and men who were there wrote it down, and it survives, and it is not long. She said she was a poor woman and a stranger, born out of his dominions, with no impartial counsel and no friend in that place. She said she took God and all the world to witness that she had been to him a true, humble and obedient wife, ever conformable to his will and pleasure, that she had loved all those he loved for his sake, whether she had cause or not, that she had been his wife these 20 years and more, and by him had had several children, though it had pleased God to call them out of this world. And she said, and this is the sentence, that when he had her first, she took God to be her judge, that she was a true maid without touch of man, and whether that was true or not, she put it to his conscience. To his conscience, in front of the papal legates and the peers of England and half of London. She had spent 2 years being told that this was a matter for his conscience, and she stood in a public courtroom, on her knees, and handed his conscience back to him with everyone watching. And then she asked him to spare her the extremity of that court, and if he would not, then God's will be done, and she would commend her cause to God. And she got up, and she took her attendant's arm, and she walked out. The crier called her back. "Catherine, Queen of England, come into the court." Her attendant told her she was being called, and she said, and this is the best line of her life, that it was no impartial court to her, and she would not tarry. And she walked on out of the door. 3 times they called her. She never came back. Never, not once, in the whole 9 years. She was declared contumacious, which is the legal term for a woman who leaves, and the case ground on without her, and everybody in that hall knew that she had just beaten them in front of an audience, because look at what she had done in 4 minutes. She had made it impossible to say she was disobedient because she had knelt. She had made it impossible to say she was disloyal because she had said she loved everyone he loved. She had put the virginity question on the record in the most solemn form available in front of a papal court and dared him to contradict her, and he did not. He sat there. He gave her nothing at all. He never answered her. That is the thing. He got up afterwards and made some remarks about how she had always been a good wife to him, and he wished the marriage could stand, which was true and irrelevant. But he did not say she was lying. In front of the whole court, with his entire case resting on it, he could not do it. And the crowd outside adored her. That is the other fact of these years that gets buried. The people of England were on her side, completely and loudly, and it never changed all the way to her death. Women shouted at the king's barge. Crowds gathered where she went. When she moved house, they came out on the road to see her. She was foreign. She had been among them close on 30 years, and they thought of her as theirs. Campeggio, being a Roman, and having been sent to do nothing very slowly, adjourned the court in the July for the Roman vacation, and it never sat again, and the case went back to Rome, and that was that. And Henry, having lost in his own courtroom to his own wife, went away and thought about it, and concluded that if the Pope would not give him what he wanted, then England would stop having a Pope. Everything after that is a demolition. The cardinal fell and died on the road to his own treason trial. The church in England was pulled away from Rome, and the monasteries came down, and men who would not sign the oath were killed, including Thomas More, who had sat at Catherine's table and read Greek with her. A new marriage was made and a new queen crowned, and the country you live in was made in that decade, and every part of it starts with a woman on her knees on a floor at Blackfriars, declining. She was moved out of the court, and then further out, and then further. Each house was smaller and damper, and further from London and further from her daughter, and she was never told she was leaving until the carts came. And before any of that, on an ordinary summer morning at Windsor, he got on a horse and rode away from her without a word, and that was the last she ever saw of him. On a morning in the July of 1531, at Windsor, Henry VIII got up early and went hunting and did not tell his wife he was going, and she never saw him again. That is the end of that marriage, and it happened like that, and I want to give the whole of it to you slowly, because there is no scene, no shouting, no farewell. He simply left the building. They had been married for 22 years. He rode out in the morning with a small party and went to another house, and after a few days a message was sent back to her that he was displeased with her, that she was to leave Windsor, and that she should choose a house to go to. She wrote to him. She said she was sorry to hear that he had gone without bidding her farewell, and that she had wished to have that comfort, and she asked when she might see him. And the answer came back from a delegation that he did not want to hear from her, that she should stop writing, that he had no time for goodbyes and would not have wanted one anyway. It was put more brutally than that. The messengers were instructed to tell her that the king did not care for her farewells. 22 years. He would not say goodbye. Now, why then? What had happened in that particular summer? Two things. The first is that the legal war had turned. The case had gone back to Rome and stalled, and the English had begun to build a different machine, an argument that the king was supreme in his own realm and that no foreign bishop had any business judging him. Parliament was being worked on. The clergy had just been forced to acknowledge him as their supreme head, with a saving clause tacked on to make it swallowable. There was no longer any need for her consent. She had stopped being an obstacle to be persuaded and become an obstacle to be moved. And the second is that she would not stop being his wife. She was still there. She was still in the rooms, still sewing his shirts, still presiding at table when the court required a queen, still greeting him with perfect wifely courtesy in front of the ambassadors. And it was unbearable, because every day she did it she was making the point without saying a word. There is an exchange between them from around that time, and it is the most revealing thing in the whole business. He complained to her, apparently, that she was making him look bad in front of everyone. And she answered him, and what she said was that she was his lawful wife, and that she would say so as long as she lived, and that if he had a scruple, then let the Pope decide it, but that she was not going to walk out of a marriage that God had made because it had become inconvenient. She was not being difficult. She was being consistent. That is what nobody in that court could cope with. Everybody else bent. Wolsey bent, and it did not save him. Bishops bent. Parliament bent. Universities were bought. The whole of England was on hinges by 1531, and there was one woman in a set of rooms at Windsor who was in exactly the same position as she had been in 1527, and was not going to move an inch. And the only thing left to do with her was to take her away. So he took the coward's exit. He got on a horse in the morning and rode out and let a servant tell her, and that is the last time they were in the same building. 4.5 more years, and not a word face to face. Everything after this is delegations and letters and men riding out to Buckton or Kimbleton with a paper for her to sign. I want to say one thing in his defense, and it will be the only one tonight. I do not think he was pretending about his conscience. That is the mistake people make with Henry VIII. They imagine a cynic. He was not a cynic. He was something much more dangerous, which is a man who genuinely could not distinguish between what he wanted and what God wanted, and who had never once in his life been made to. He read that verse in Leviticus, and he believed it, absolutely. And the more he wanted the young woman with the French manners, the more absolutely he believed it. The two of them were one and the same inside him, and he could not tell. That is why he could not simply put Catherine aside and pension her off, which is what any ordinary king would have done. He needed her to agree. He needed the record to show that he had been right all along, because if she was his wife, then he was an adulterer, and his children were bastards, and God was angry with him, and that thought was intolerable, and so it had to be untrue. And so she had to say it was untrue. She never did. Not once. In 9 years, under everything they could think of, and the things they thought of were considerable. She was moved from house to house, each further from London, each worse. Her income was cut. Her servants were taken. She was told she was no longer to be called queen. Men came in delegations and stood over her and argued for hours. Her confessor was replaced with somebody else's man. And in the end, when nothing else had worked, they took her daughter away and did not give her back. That last one was the only weapon that ever came close, and they knew it, and they used it for 4.5 years, and I want to give you that chapter now, because Mary is the other half of Catherine of Aragon, and you cannot understand the end without her. Mary Tudor was the only child of that marriage who lived, and everything her mother did after 1527 was done for her, and the two of them were separated when the girl was 15 and never allowed to meet again. Let me give her to you as she was before it all went wrong, because she was, for the first decade of her life, the most fortunate child in Europe. She was born in the February of 1516, the 5th pregnancy, the one that lived, and her father, who was disappointed and did not show it, said that the sons would follow. And then, when they did not, all that enormous royal attention came down and settled on this one little girl. She was adored. That is the word the ambassadors use. Her father showed her off constantly. He would carry her round a room full of courtiers, boasting, and on one famous occasion he had her brought in to be admired by the French embassy, and she performed on the virginals for them at 4 years old, and the room went to pieces. He called her his pearl of the world, and her mother educated her exactly as her mother had been educated. That is the through line I want you to hold. Isabella of Castile in a war camp hired the finest woman scholar in Spain to teach her daughters Latin, and her daughter, 30 years later in England, sent for a Spanish humanist and had him write a curriculum, and Mary Tudor was taught Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, music, and the classics by the best people available, on her mother's instruction and to her mother's specification. The book that Vives wrote for her, The Plan of Study, is one of the founding documents of women's education in Europe, and it exists because a Spanish queen in England wanted her daughter taught properly, and Catherine taught her herself personally when she could. There is a note about her correcting the child's Latin exercises with her own hand. She was Princess of Wales in all but the formal creation, and she was sent to Ludlow at 9 with her own household to learn to govern, which is where they sent the heir, and the message could not have been clearer. And then, at 11, it started, and by 15 the world had turned over. Here is what happened to that girl in 5 years. Her father declared that her parents had never been married. That made her, in law, a bastard, not a princess, not the heir, not Mary of England, but the Lady Mary, and she was told to answer to it, and she would not. Her household was broken up. Her governess, who had raised her, was removed. She went to serve in the household of her infant half-sister as an attendant at 17 in a house run by the new Queen's aunt, and she was told to travel in the second carriage. She was ill for years, and the descriptions of the illness suggest something wretched and gynecological, and made worse by grief and terror, and her physician was taken away too. She thought she was going to be poisoned, and so did her mother, and given what that court had already done, nobody can call either of them hysterical for it. And she was not allowed to see her mother. Not once, in 4.5 years. They were often within a day's ride. Catherine wrote and begged, more than once, offering to nurse the girl herself in her own rooms when they were both sick, and it was refused every time. Now, why? Why be so vicious to a girl of 17? Because she was the argument. If Mary was legitimate, then Catherine was the queen, and if Catherine was the queen, then the whole enormous machine of the last decade was a crime. The girl's existence was a standing contradiction of the official truth, and so the girl had to be broken into agreeing. And because she was a hostage, that is the plainer answer. Every delegation that went to Catherine with a paper carried underneath it the unstated point that her daughter's treatment depended on her signature. They both knew. Neither of them signed, and I want to give you the letters, because they are the best thing either of these women left behind. Catherine wrote to her, in those years, knowing the letters would be read by other people before Mary ever saw them. She told her to obey the king in all things, save only where it touched God and her conscience. She told her that we never come to the kingdom of heaven but by troubles. She told her to keep her Latin going and to be of good cheer, and in one of them, in the middle of the worst of it, to answer with few words, and be careful. That is a mother in a damp house telling a frightened child how to survive an interrogation, and doing it in a letter she knows her enemies will read first, in a code of piety they cannot object to. Mary held out. For years alone at 17, 18, 19 against her own father, with her mother dead at the end of it, and no one at all left to write to her, she went on, refusing to sign the acknowledgement that she was a bastard. She broke in the end. That is the truth, and I will not tidy it. 6 months after Catherine died, with the new queen dead too, and Cromwell telling her plainly that she would be tried and killed if she did not, and with no mother alive to say, hold on, she signed. She signed everything, that the marriage of her parents had been incestuous and unlawful, and that her father was supreme head of the church, and she never got over it. She wrote afterwards that she had done it against her conscience. 20 years later, she was Queen of England, the first woman ever to hold this country in her own right, and she took her mother's cause and drove it through the length of the kingdom with a violence that got her a nickname she has never lost. That is a different evening, and I am not going to pretend it is a happy one. But I will say this. Everything Mary Tudor became was made in those 5 years. The certainty, the grip, the terrible inability to let go of a point, and the deep, unhealing wound of having signed. That is her mother in her, and her grandmother behind that, going back to a woman in armour outside Granada who was sure, and before we go to the room in the fens where that letter was written, there is a debt to pay, and I am not going to leave it unpaid. Catherine of Aragon did not fight alone in the sense that nobody agreed with her. A great many people agreed with her, and some of them were killed for it, and I am not going to leave them out. Start with the bishop. John Fisher was Bishop of Rochester, and he was the finest scholar on the English bench, and one of the very few clerics in that country who could not be bought, bullied or bored into agreement. He had been the old king's mother's confessor. He had refounded colleges at Cambridge. He was 70 years old, and he lived like a monk and had a skull on his desk to remind himself of the point. And at the legatine court he stood up and did the thing that nobody else in England had the nerve to do. He said that the marriage could not be dissolved by any power on earth, and that he was ready to lay down his life for it, and that he would be like John the Baptist, who died rather than keep quiet about a king's marriage. To say that, in that room, in front of that king, was to compare Henry VIII to Herod out loud to his face. There is a report of the king's expression. Fisher knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway, and I think it is the bravest single sentence spoken in England in that century. He was Catherine's counsel. He wrote treatises for her case, several of them, and he smuggled letters, and he was the one man in the English church who never wavered by an inch. And in 1534 he refused the oath, and he went to the Tower, and they kept him there for over a year, while his clothes rotted off him and he starved, and he was so weak at the end that he had to be carried to the scaffold in a chair. The Pope, with a timing so catastrophic that you could weep, made him a cardinal while he was in prison, apparently hoping it would protect him. The king said that he would send the head to Rome for the hat. He was beheaded on Tower Hill in the June of 1535 at 76. She was alive to hear it. She had 7 months to go. Then Thomas More, who had sat at her table and argued Greek with her and written verses in her honour, and whose daughters were the most educated women in England after Mary because of the household he built in her image. He would not swear the oath either. He never said why, publicly, not once, all through his trial, because he was the best lawyer in England, and he knew that silence could not be treason. They killed him anyway, 2 weeks after Fisher, on a perjured account of a private conversation. Then the Carthusians. This is the one nobody remembers, and it is the worst. The monks of the London Charterhouse would not take the oath, and their priors were taken and hanged and cut down alive and butchered at Tyburn in their habits. And the rest were worked through over the following years, some of them chained to posts in Newgate and left to starve to death standing up. Then Elizabeth Barton, who is the strangest of them, and I want you to have her because she is the only working-class person in this entire evening. She was a servant girl in Kent. She fell ill, and in her illness she began to speak in a voice that was not hers, and to say things she could not have known, and she recovered, and people came to see her. She became a nun, and for years she was the most famous woman in England, consulted by archbishops, taken seriously by scholars, and by Thomas More, who was careful about her, but did not dismiss her. And she started saying that if the king put away his wife and married another, he would not be king a month longer, and would die a villain's death. She said it to his face. She got in front of Henry VIII twice, and told him that God would not have it. They hanged her at Tyburn in the April of 1534, with 5 priests who had believed her, and they cut off her head and put it on London Bridge, and she is the only woman in English history to be honoured that way. She was about 28. She was a servant from Kent who had never met the queen she died for. Now, I want to be careful and fair here, because there is a version of this in which Catherine used these people, and it is not true. She was scrupulous. She warned people off. When Barton's prophecies were flying about, she refused to see her and refused to have anything to do with her, expressly and on the record, and that refusal is very probably what saved Catherine's own life, because when the government came to build a treason case out of it, there was nothing to attach to her, and she never once called for a rising. That is the fact that ought to be better known. Her nephew was the most powerful man in Europe, and had an army and a fleet, and the Pope in his pocket. There were men in England, serious ones, in the north, who would have come out for her. The imperial ambassador told her, more than once, that the country was ready, and that all she had to do was say the word. She would not say it. She said that she would not be the cause of a war in the country that had been her home for 30 years, and that no crown was worth Christian blood. And she meant it. and she never moved from it. Sit with that against everything else you have heard tonight. She could have had a civil war. She was entitled to it by the standards of that age. Men had taken the English throne with less. She had the Emperor, the Pope, the Church, the North, the women of London, and a genuine legal case that she was actually winning, and she would not use any of it because people would have died. She lost. Of course she lost. That is what happens when one side will not fight and the other will do anything at all. But I do not think she was defeated, and neither did the crowds on the roads, and neither, in the end, did he, or he would not have spent 9 years and a church trying to make her agree. Now let us go to Kimbleton and be quiet, because she is very tired. Kimbleton is a house in Huntingdonshire, in flat, wet country, and she was moved there in the spring of 1534, and she lived in a few rooms of it for the last 20 months of her life. And it is the end of the road we started on in a war camp in Castile. The house was damp. That is not a metaphor. The fens were undrained then, and the water was in the walls. And she was ill. For most of the time she was there, and the illness was never identified. She had a handful of servants left, a few Spaniards who had refused to leave her, and a physician and an apothecary and her old confessor. Everybody else had been taken away. She lived, in the end, in one room and its closet, and she almost never came out of it. She would not eat food prepared by anyone she did not know, and I do not think that was paranoia. There had been talk at that court, quite openly, about what a convenient thing her death would be. Her women cooked for her over the fire in her own chamber. She heard mass through a door. She was 50. She had been in England for 33 years, and she would not sign. That is the whole of these 20 months. They sent men to her over and over in delegations, and they laid papers in front of her and asked her to acknowledge that she was not the Queen, but the Princess Dowager, the widow of Prince Arthur, and that her marriage had been no marriage. And every time she said no and told them she was the King's true wife, and that she would be called by no other name. They would not address her as Queen. She would not answer to anything else. Letters were sent to the Princess Dowager, and she refused to open them. Servants who called her Princess Dowager were dismissed from her rooms. It sounds petty when you write it down like that. It was not petty. It was the only front left. Every single thing had been taken from her except the ability to withhold her name from a lie. And so she withheld it for 20 months in a damp room, and it drove that entire government mad, because if she had signed, it was finished. That is what people forget. Her signature would have ended it. The Pope's case would have collapsed. Mary would have been quietly made legitimate by Act of Parliament, or bought off with a marriage, and Catherine would have been given a great house and an income, and left in comfortable dignity. It was offered, repeatedly. She would not do it, and she would not do it because of one thing. Her daughter had been declared a bastard, and Catherine had spent 9 years fighting to prevent that. And if she signed, she made it true with her own hand. Everything else she could bear. She could bear the damp, and the humiliation, and the loss of the man, and the sight of another woman in her rooms. She could not be the person who signed the paper that said her child was nothing, and they held the girl over her the whole time. That is the cruelty I find hardest to forgive, and we have already seen the shape of it. It was the one lever that ever came near working, and they had their hands on it every single day of those 20 months, and they never once let go. She wrote to Mary in those years, and some of the letters survive, and they will take the top of your head off. She tells her daughter to obey the king in everything, except where it touches God. She tells her not to be afraid. She tells her that if this is a trial God has sent, then they are fortunate to be given it, and that they must take it as a gift. She tells her to keep her heart clean and her mind quiet, and to go on with her Latin. She was dying in a fen, and she was still checking on her daughter's Latin. In the December of 1535, she got much worse. And two things came at the end, and both of them matter. The first is that they let her have a visitor. Maria de Salinas, who had come from Spain with her 34 years earlier as a girl in her train, who had married an English lord and stayed in the country, rode to Kimbleton in the winter without permission, talked her way past the gate with a story about a fall from her horse, and got in. And once she was in, they could not get her out again, and she nursed her old mistress and was with her at the end. 34 years. She had come over on that terrible crossing with a 15-year-old girl, and she was there in the room at the end. Somebody stayed. The second is the last letter. There is a letter said to have been sent to Henry from her deathbed, and its authenticity is argued about, and I am going to give it to you anyway with that flag on it, because it is the most famous thing she ever wrote, and because it sounds exactly like her. She calls him her most dear lord, king and husband, which is the whole argument in 6 words. She says the hour of her death is near, and she must remind him of the health and safety of his soul, which he ought to prefer before all worldly matters. She commends their daughter to him, and asks him to be a good father to her. She asks him to look after her servants, 3 of them by name, and to see her maids given their marriage portions. And she ends by saying that she vows her eyes desire him above all things. She was dying in a damp room discarded, and the last thing she did was worry about his soul and ask for dowries for her maids. She died on the 7th of January 1536 in the morning, at about 50 years old. Her women said she had been praying since 2 in the night. They found, when they laid her out, that she had been wearing the habit of the Franciscan order under her clothes. And when the news reached the court at Greenwich, the king dressed in yellow from head to foot, and put a feather in his cap, and had his daughter Elizabeth carried into the chapel with the trumpets going in front of her, and danced. 3 weeks later, the woman who had taken her place miscarried a boy, and the whole business started again. They buried her on the 29th of January at the Abbey Church at Peterborough, which was the nearest great house of God to where she had died, and it was a careful, deliberate insult from beginning to end. She was buried as Dowager Princess of Wales, not as Queen. Every banner, every hatchment, every word spoken over her was arranged to say that she had been Arthur's widow and nothing more, and the mourners were chosen accordingly. A countess as chief mourner, some ladies, some bishops going through it at speed. The emperor's ambassador, who had been her only friend at that court for years, and who had ridden out to see her at Kimbleton at the end, refused to attend, because to walk in that procession would have been to accept the title, and he would not do it, and I have always liked him enormously for that. Her own women went. Of course they did. They had carried her this far, and they put her in the ground, on the north side of the choir, under a plain stone, in a market town in the Fen country, 400 miles and a sea away from Granada, where her mother lies in marble with the pomegranates carved on it. There is one more thing, and it is the only piece of luck in the whole story. 4 years later, Henry VIII pulled down the monasteries of England, all of them, and Peterborough Abbey should have gone with the rest, the roof off, the lead away, the stone carted for somebody's barn, and the graves under it turned out into the mud. And it did not happen. In 1541, that abbey was made a cathedral instead, one of a handful spared, and the tradition, which cannot be proved, and which I choose to believe, is that he spared it because she was in it. He would not say goodbye to her. He would not attend the funeral. He danced in yellow when he heard. And then, when he was breaking every abbey in England, he left standing the one with her in the floor. Make of that what you will. I have made what I can of it for years, and I am no further on. There is one last thing to do tonight, and then we can let them all go, and it is to set the two of them side by side, because they died 19 years apart in 2 locked rooms and nobody has ever really added them up. When Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbleton in the January of 1536, her sister Juana was alive. I do not know whether they told her. I doubt it. She had been in the house at Tordesillas for 27 of them by then, and she had another 19 to go, and the youngest sister, the baby of that Spanish schoolroom, was already in the ground at Peterborough. Look at the two of them. Both were educated by the finest scholars in Europe to rule kingdoms. Both were sent abroad as girls to seal a treaty. Both were married to men who wanted what they carried rather than what they were. Both, when their mother's certainty came out in them, were told they were unwell, or difficult, or obstinate. Both were separated from their children by the men who had power over them. Both were shut up in a house at the end of a road with a few servants and a priest, on the instruction of a family member who wanted what they had. Both were handed a document and told to sign away the one thing that was theirs by right. Neither of them ever signed it, and both of them died in that room unbroken and unbeaten and unfree, still saying the same word. That word was no. Two of them, at opposite ends of a continent, who had last laid eyes on one another as girls, holding the same line, year upon year, and neither ever knew, and they were not being stubborn. I won't say that carefully, because both of them have been called stubborn by people who ought to know better. They were doing the only thing available to them. When everything else has been taken from you, the last property you own is your consent, and neither of those women would sell it. And that is not obstinacy. That is the final form of self-possession. Now the accounting, and then we are finished. Isabella, the eldest, who wanted a convent and was made to marry twice, died at 27 in childbirth in Zaragoza. Her son died before he was 2. She left nothing but a hole where a united peninsula would have been, and a set of decrees driving out the Jews of Portugal that she had demanded as her wedding terms. Juan, the golden boy, married in the April and buried in the October at 19. He left a white tomb at Avila, a widow of 17 who went home and governed the Netherlands for the best part of 30 years, and a daughter who never drew breath. Maria, the quiet one, married her dead sister's husband at 18, had 10 children in 17 summers, and was worn out and finished at 35. And she is the one, of all of them, whose blood went furthest. Her 9 children married into everything, and her daughter's son was the next king of Spain, and half the crowned heads of Europe by 1580 came out of the sister nobody bothered to write about. Juana, who was the cleverest of them, and possibly the best musician, and certainly the one with the strongest claim, was Queen of Castile for 51 years and governed for less than 2. She was locked up at 29 and died at 75. Her children ran the world, 2 emperors and 4 queens, and she never saw any of it. Her son took her crown and kept her in a room until it was over, and then buried her beside her mother in Granada, which is the only thing he ever gave her that she had asked for, and Catalina, the baby, the one they promised to England at 3 and shipped out at 15, 35 winters in a foreign country, 6 pregnancies and 1 living child, regent of England and the victor of Flodden by proxy, and the woman who brought the new learning into that country and got girls taught in it. Then a decade of open war with the most dangerous man in Europe fought alone, and she was still winning on the merits when he simply changed the rules and took the church out from under her. And her daughter, that one child she had spent everything to protect, became Queen of England anyway. Mary got the crown in the end. She was the first woman ever to rule this country in her own right, and she got it because her mother would not, under any pressure they could invent, Put her name to a lie about her own child. That is what Catherine of Aragon left, not the marriage. She lost the marriage. She left a queen. And the last thing, which is small and which I have kept back all evening. 17 years after she died, Mary was on the throne, and she wanted her mother brought to lie beside her in state, and it never happened, because Mary died first, at 42, with nothing settled, and her Boleyn sister took the crown and held it for 4 decades and more. So Catherine is still at Peterborough, not in an abbey in Spain, not beside her mother in Granada where her sister and her brother-in-law lie, not in Westminster with the kings. She is in a cathedral in a market town in the English Midlands, under a plain slab with a Spanish pomegranate on the ironwork, and there are almost always flowers on it, and pomegranates, and a good many of them are put there by women who drove some distance to do it. She has been dead for nearly 5 centuries and people still bring her flowers. Nobody organises it. They just come. Her sister is in Granada, in the royal chapel, next to their mother, and there are flowers there too. 2 of the 5 children of that war camp, lying at the 2 ends of the map their mother spent them on, and neither of them, at the very end of it, willing to give the men with the papers one single thing. And now let it all go quiet. There is nothing left to decide tonight, and nobody left to argue with, and the 5 of them can rest. Let the war camp fold itself up. The tents come down off the plain, the oxen are unhitched, the standards go into their cases, and the great column that carried a household and a chapel and 5 children across a country turns for home in the evening light, and the dust settles behind it. And the plain is only a plain. Let the schoolroom go dark. The books are shut and put back on the shelf, and La Latina takes her candle away, and 4 girls who could read Latin better than most bishops in Europe go up to bed in a house that is warm, with their brother down the corridor, and the whole of it still ahead of them, and none of it decided. Let the sea lie down flat. Let everything that was ever launched to carry a daughter of that house away from it stay tied up at the quay tonight, sails furled, going nowhere, in the dark, with the water slapping quietly at the hulls. Let the house on the Duero open its shutters just for tonight, and let the light come in off the water, and let the woman inside it sit where she can see the river. And let the fens be still. There is a cathedral in a market town in the middle of England, and under the floor of it, near the north wall, there is a Spanish infanta who came ashore at Plymouth in the rain when she was 15 and never went home. Somebody left flowers on her stone this week. Somebody always does. She has her mother's stubbornness, and her mother's Latin, and mother's absolute conviction, and she is lying a very long way from Granada. And tonight, in the dark, that is all right. It is finished. Nobody can move her again, and nobody can ask her to sign anything, and nobody is coming with a paper. If tonight was good company, there is more of it, and you are very welcome to come along for the next one, and then it will find you when you would like it. And if you want to leave a word behind you before you go, I do love reading them, whatever the hour is on your side of the world. Thank you for these hours. I have liked them very much. Rest now. 5 children in a tent on a hot plain, learning their verbs, with their mother somewhere out at the guns, and the whole of it still in front of them. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.